boring history for sleep, the most bizarre biblical diseases and their cures, and more. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make your skin crawl just a little bit. We're diving into the most bizarre biblical diseases and their so-called cures. A journey through ancient medicine that will make you grateful for modern healthcare, antibiotics, and the simple luxury of soap. You think dealing with a common cold is rough? Try living in biblical times when leprosy could get you permanently exiled from society, or when a simple skin condition could be interpreted as divine punishment. The Bible isn't just a religious text. It's also an accidental medical journal from thousands of years ago, documenting diseases that terrified ancient civilizations and the desperate measures people took to cure them. But here's the thing that most people don't realize. Many of these mysterious biblical ailments weren't supernatural at all. They were real diseases with real symptoms, interpreted through the lens of ancient understanding and religious belief. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially when we're about to explore some of humanity's oldest medical mysteries. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore diseases that could turn you into a social outcast overnight. Remedies that involved everything from bird blood to human sacrifice, and medical practices that would make a medieval barber surgeon look like a modern neurosurgeon. You wake up in ancient Israel, and there's a small, pale patch on your arm that wasn't there yesterday. It's slightly raised, and when you touch it, you realize with growing horror that you can't feel anything. No pain, no sensation, just nothing. Your heart starts racing because you know exactly what this means. In a world where leprosy is both a medical condition and a spiritual curse, you're about to become the walking dead. The Hebrew word zarath, that gets translated as leprosy in most Bibles, actually covered a whole spectrum of skin conditions. Modern scholars believe it included everything from psoriasis to vitiligo, from fungal infections to what we now know as Hansen's disease, true leprosy. But in biblical times, they didn't have the luxury of differential diagnosis. If your skin changed color, if you developed spots, if you lost sensation, you were unclean. You're dragged before the priest. Not a doctor, mind you, but a religious official who doubles as the community's chief medical examiner. The priest examines your skin with all the medical knowledge of someone whose primary qualification is knowing how to sacrifice goats. He looks at the patch, pokes at it with a stick, and asks if the hair in the affected area has turned white. This is apparently a crucial diagnostic criterion, though nobody really knows why. The examination process is surprisingly thorough for ancient times. The priest checks not just the obvious spots, but examines your entire body, looking for signs of spreading. He pays particular attention to your scalp, your beard, and any areas where the skin might be thinner. If he's uncertain about the diagnosis, you get a 7-day quarantine period, essentially a medical timeout, while everyone waits to see if your condition worsens. But here's where it gets really bizarre. The priest also examines your clothes and even your house for signs of leprosy. Yes, you read that right. They believed that buildings and fabric could contract the same condition as humans. This was probably their way of dealing with what we now know as mold, fungal growths or mineral deposits that could cause discoloration in textiles and walls. If the priest determines that you have zarath, your life as you know it is over. You're declared unclean and must leave the community immediately. But it's not just exile, it's a form of social death. You have to tear your clothes, leave your hair uncombed, cover your mouth, and walk around shouting, "Unclean! Unclean!" to warn others of your approach. Imagine being forced to announce your medical condition to every person you encounter, like a human hazard sign. The psychological trauma of this process was probably worse than many of the actual medical conditions. You're not just dealing with a skin disease. You're dealing with complete social isolation, economic ruin, and the constant reminder that your community believes you're cursed by God. Your family can't touch you. Your friends won't speak to you. And your only companions are other outcasts living in caves or makeshift settlements outside the city walls. But here's the thing that makes this even more tragic. Many of these conditions weren't contagious at all. Psoriasis, vitiligo, and various autoimmune conditions can cause exactly the kind of skin changes that would trigger a dry diagnosis, but they pose no risk to others. These people were being exiled and socially destroyed for having conditions that were often genetic, stress-related, or caused by nutritional deficiencies. The cure for Xerath was as complex as the diagnosis. If you somehow recovered, which did happen with certain temporary conditions, you couldn't just waltz back into society. You had to undergo an elaborate purification ritual involving 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. One bird would be killed over fresh water, and the other would be dipped in the blood of the first bird mixed with the water, then released. This blood-water mixture would then be sprinkled on you 7 times before you could be declared clean. The whole process reveals something fascinating about ancient medical thinking. They understood that some skin conditions were temporary and could resolve on their own, but they also believed that the spiritual and physical realms were inseparably connected. Your skin condition wasn't just a medical problem. It was a reflection of your spiritual state, your relationship with the divine, and your place in the cosmic order. You're standing in the court of Pharaoh, and the air itself seems to be writhing with invisible menace. Moses has just thrown handfuls of soot from a furnace into the air, and within hours, something horrifying begins to happen. Painful boils start erupting on the skin of every Egyptian, from the lowest servant to Pharaoh himself. Even the livestock aren't spared. This is the 6th plague, and it's about to demonstrate just how devastating a dermatological disaster can be in the ancient world. The Hebrew word shishan refers to inflammatory skin lesions that were filled with pus and extremely painful. Modern medical analysis suggests these could have been anything from staph infections to anthrax cutaneous lesions, or even a form of smallpox. But in a world without antiseptics, antibiotics, or even basic understanding of bacterial infections, these boils were essentially death sentences for many who contracted them. Picture the scene. You're an Egyptian farmer who is just trying to survive another day under Pharaoh's rule. And suddenly your skin becomes a battlefield. The boils start small, maybe just a red, tender bump that you initially mistake for an insect bite. But within hours, it's swollen to the size of a grape, filled with pus, and throbbing with a pain that makes it impossible to concentrate on anything else. And then you notice another one forming nearby. The medical understanding of the time was virtually non-existent. Ancient Egyptian physicians, who were actually quite advanced for their era, had treatments for many conditions, but a sudden outbreak of severe skin infections affecting the entire population was beyond their capabilities. They tried everything from honey poultices to incantations, from bleeding to prayer, but nothing worked. The boils kept spreading, kept multiplying, kept causing excruciating pain. What made this plague particularly devastating was its universality. Unlike leprosy, which affected individuals and could be contained through isolation, this condition struck everyone simultaneously. The royal physicians were suffering from the same boils they were trying to treat. The priests responsible for healing rituals couldn't perform their duties because their own hands were covered in painful lesions. Even the animals used for sacrifice were affected, making religious intervention impossible. The psychological impact was just as severe as the physical suffering. In a culture that believed illness was connected to divine displeasure, having the entire population suddenly afflicted with painful skin conditions was interpreted as a sign of cosmic disorder. The gods themselves seemed to be turning against Egypt, and no amount of prayer, sacrifice, or ritual could stop the spreading infection. But here's where the medical reality gets interesting. The biblical account specifies that the boils were accompanied by breaking forth with blains upon man and beast. The word blains suggests vesicles or blisters, which could indicate a viral infection like chickenpox or smallpox. If it was smallpox, the mortality rate would have been catastrophic, potentially 30% or higher in a population with no previous exposure. The treatment methods available to ancient Egyptian physicians were primitive by modern standards, but showed a surprising understanding of infection control. They used honey, which we now know has antimicrobial properties, and various plant-based remedies that may have had some anti-inflammatory effects. They also practiced a form of isolation, keeping the severely affected away from others, though they didn't understand the mechanism of contagion. What's particularly fascinating is that the biblical account suggests this plague lasted for a specific, limited time before disappearing as suddenly as it began. This pattern is consistent with certain epidemic diseases that burn through a population quickly and then fade away, either because of developing immunity or because the pathogen exhausts its pool of susceptible hosts. The idea that divine intervention could cause such a precisely timed epidemic to both begin and end speaks to a sophisticated understanding of disease patterns. The long-term consequences for Egyptian society would have been severe. If this was indeed smallpox or a similar disease, the survivors would have been left with permanent scarring and potential blindness. The economic impact of having an entire population temporarily incapacitated would have been devastating, affecting everything from agricultural production to military readiness. It's no wonder that Pharaoh's resolve finally began to crack under the cumulative pressure of these disasters. You're a Philistine warrior, and you've just helped capture the most sacred object in Israelite religion, the Ark of the Covenant. You and your fellow warriors are celebrating what seems like the ultimate victory over your enemies. But within days, something starts happening to your people that's so embarrassing and painful that the biblical writers could barely bring themselves to describe it explicitly. You're about to experience one of history's most unusual divine punishments, a plague of hemorrhoids. The Hebrew word chorim and the related term opalem appear in the text, and translators have had a field day trying to figure out exactly what these words mean. Some ancient texts suggest tumors, others indicate hemorrhoids, and still others point to some kind of genital plague. The King James Version diplomatically refers to them as emerods, which was a medieval term for hemorrhoids, but the reality was probably much more complex and definitely more unpleasant. Imagine being a proud Philistine citizen of Ashdod, the city where the ark was first taken. You wake up one morning with what feels like a small tender bump near your anal opening. It's uncomfortable, but you figure it's just from sitting too long, or perhaps from the heavy lifting involved in moving the ark. But by the next day, the pain has intensified dramatically, and you can barely sit down without wincing. Walking becomes an exercise in careful, mincing steps. The medical reality of hemorrhoids in the ancient world was genuinely hellish. Without modern understanding of vascular conditions, dietary fiber, or proper hygiene, what we consider a manageable if uncomfortable condition became a debilitating and potentially life-threatening problem. The constant straining, the lack of soft toilet paper, and the general poor sanitation of ancient cities would have made hemorrhoids a recurring nightmare for many people. But the biblical account suggests this wasn't just ordinary hemorrhoids affecting a few individuals. This was a citywide epidemic of painful anal conditions. Modern medical analysis suggests this could have been an outbreak of dysentery or another intestinal disease that caused severe diarrhea and subsequent hemorrhoidal complications. The constant straining associated with dysentery would have caused hemorrhoids to develop in people who had never experienced them before. The Philistines, being a practical people, decided to move the ark to another city, hoping to escape the plague. So they sent it to Gath, where exactly the same thing happened. The population of Gath was struck with the same painful condition, causing what the biblical text describes as a very great destruction. People were presumably unable to work, walk properly, or perform basic daily functions because of the severity of their symptoms. The descriptions from ancient sources paint a picture of absolute misery. People couldn't sit comfortably, couldn't lie down without pain, and couldn't perform basic bodily functions without excruciating discomfort. The psychological impact of having an entire population suffering from the same embarrassing and painful condition would have been enormous. It's one thing to suffer from hemorrhoids privately. It's another to have your entire community groaning and wincing in unison. The medical treatments available to the Philistines were limited and often counterproductive. They might have used astringent herbs, cold water applications, or various oils. But without understanding the underlying vascular causes, these treatments would have provided minimal relief. Some ancient remedies actually made things worse. Certain herbs could cause additional irritation or inflammation. What makes this plague particularly interesting from a medical perspective is the Philistines' eventual solution. After the ark had caused similar problems in multiple cities, they consulted their priests and diviners, who recommended a guilt offering consisting of golden images of their hemorrhoids. This wasn't just primitive superstition. It was an early form of sympathetic magic that revealed a sophisticated understanding of psychosomatic healing. The golden hemorrhoids were accompanied by golden mice, suggesting that the plague might have been connected to a rodent-borne illness. This would make sense if the underlying cause was an epidemic of dysentery or food poisoning that led to the hemorrhoidal complications. Rats and mice were common vectors for diseases that could cause severe intestinal distress, and their presence in grain storage areas would have made contamination likely. The resolution of this plague came when the Philistines finally returned the ark to the Israelites, along with their golden guilt offering. The timing suggests that whatever pathogen was causing the epidemic had run its course, or that improved sanitation and dietary changes had allowed the population to recover. The fact that the symptoms disappeared after the ark was returned would have reinforced the religious interpretation of the event. You are lying on your deathbed, and something is eating you alive from the inside. It's not a metaphor. There are actual worms crawling through your intestines, and you can feel them moving. You're Herod Agrippa I, the king who just moments ago was being praised as a god by the crowd in Caesarea. But now, as divine punishment for accepting worship that belongs only to God, you're experiencing one of the most gruesome deaths recorded in biblical history. The account in Acts describes how Herod was eaten of worms and died. But the medical reality behind this dramatic description is even more disturbing than the biblical narrative suggests. Modern medical analysis points to a condition called myiasis, infestation by parasitic larvae, or possibly a severe case of intestinal worms that had reached a critical mass in his digestive system. Picture the progression of this condition. It probably started weeks or months earlier with what seemed like ordinary digestive issues. Perhaps you noticed some discomfort after eating, or maybe your bowel movements weren't quite normal. But these symptoms were subtle enough that a busy king would have ignored them or attributed them to stress and rich food. Ancient rulers weren't exactly known for their healthy diets or moderate lifestyles. The medical understanding of parasitic infections in the 1st century was primitive at best. Physicians of the time recognized that worms could infest the human body, but they had no understanding of life cycles, vectors, or effective treatments. They knew that certain herbs might help expel worms, but they couldn't prevent reinfestation or address the underlying causes of severe parasitic diseases. As the infestation progressed, you would have experienced increasingly severe symptoms. Abdominal pain would have intensified, accompanied by nausea, vomiting, and potentially visible worms in your stool. The psychological horror of literally seeing parasites emerging from your body would have been overwhelming, especially for someone accustomed to the luxury and comfort of royal life. But the biblical account suggests something even more dramatic: worms that were actively consuming living tissue. This could point to a condition like intestinal myiasis, where fly larvae actually burrow into and consume human tissue. The larvae of certain flies, particularly the botfly or screwworm fly, can cause exactly this kind of internal destruction. The victim remains conscious and aware while being literally eaten alive from within. The pain associated with this condition would have been excruciating and constant. Unlike external wounds that might heal or be treated with available remedies, internal parasitic infestation was essentially untreatable with ancient medical knowledge. You would have been helpless to stop the progression of the disease, forced to endure the sensation of creatures moving and feeding inside your body. The timing of Herod's death, occurring immediately after he accepted divine worship, created a powerful theological narrative about divine justice. But the medical reality suggests that his condition had been developing for some time. The stress of the public event, combined with the advanced stage of his parasitic infection, likely triggered the final crisis that led to his death. Ancient physicians would have tried various treatments, all of them essentially useless against a severe internal infestation. They might have administered purgatives to try to expel the worms, or used bitter herbs that were thought to create an inhospitable environment for parasites. Some remedies involved fasting, which would have weakened an already compromised patient even further. The description of being eaten of worms also appears in other ancient sources describing similar deaths. The Roman historian Josephus provides additional details about Herod's death, including descriptions of intense abdominal pain and the presence of worms in his excrement. This suggests that the condition was severe enough to be observed by multiple witnesses. The psychological impact of this kind of death would have been devastating, not just for the victim, but for anyone who witnessed it. The idea of being consumed by worms while still alive tapped into primal fears about corruption, decay, and loss of bodily integrity. For a king who had just been praised as divine, dying in such a degrading manner would have been seen as the ultimate cosmic reversal. Modern medical understanding reveals that severe parasitic infections can indeed cause the kind of dramatic symptoms described in the biblical account. Intestinal obstruction caused by masses of worms, tissue damage from larvae, and systemic infection from parasitic toxins can all contribute to a death that appears to involve being eaten alive. The medical reality behind this biblical plague was genuinely as horrific as the religious narrative suggests. You are the most powerful man in the ancient world, ruler of the vast Babylonian Empire, commander of armies that have conquered nation after nation. Your hanging gardens are counted among the wonders of the world, and your name strikes fear into the hearts of kings from Egypt to Persia. But suddenly, your mind begins to fracture in ways that will strip away not just your sanity, but your very humanity. You're about to experience what might be history's most dramatic case of psychological breakdown. The Book of Daniel describes how King Nebuchadnezzar was driven from men and lived like a wild animal, eating grass like cattle, with hair that grew like eagle's feathers and nails like birds' claws. Modern psychiatrists and medical historians have proposed various diagnoses for this condition, ranging from clinical lycanthropy to severe psychotic episodes. But the most compelling explanation might be a rare psychological condition called boanthropy, the delusion that one has become a cow or other grazing animal. Imagine the gradual onset of this condition. You're sitting in your throne room, reviewing reports from your governors and military commanders, when suddenly you have the overwhelming urge to go outside and eat grass. Not as a joke or a whim, but as a genuine compulsion driven by the absolute conviction that this is what you're supposed to do. Your advisors watch in horror as the mighty king of Babylon drops to his hands and knees and begins grazing like livestock. The medical reality of boanthropy is genuinely terrifying. Patients experiencing this condition don't just think they're animals. They fully embody the behavior, including the dietary habits, social patterns, and even the posture of the animal they believe they've become. They may refuse human food, preferring to eat grass, leaves, or other vegetation. They might avoid human contact, sleeping outdoors, and rejecting clothing or shelter. The transformation described in Daniel suggests a complete psychological break from reality that persisted for 7 times. possibly 7 years. During this period, Nebuchadnezzar would have been completely incapable of ruling his empire. The practical implications of having the supreme ruler of Babylon suddenly become convinced he was a grazing animal would have been catastrophic for the political stability of the entire region. Ancient understanding of mental illness was primitive and heavily influenced by religious beliefs. The Babylonians, like most ancient cultures, interpreted severe mental illness as either divine punishment or demonic possession. They had no concept of neurochemical imbalances, psychological trauma, or the complex interplay of factors that can trigger severe psychiatric episodes. The idea that their god-king could simply lose his mind was almost incomprehensible. The physical symptoms described in the biblical account, hair growing like eagles, feathers and nails like birds' claws, suggest that Nebuchadnezzar was living outdoors without basic human grooming or hygiene. His hair would have become matted and wild. His nails would have grown long and curved from lack of trimming, and his skin would have been weathered and damaged from constant exposure to the elements. The dietary changes would have been particularly devastating to his health. The human digestive system is not designed to process grass and other vegetation that forms the primary diet of grazing animals. He would have suffered from severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and possibly dangerous intestinal blockages from consuming indigestible plant matter. The fact that he survived 7 years in this condition suggests either divine intervention or that his delusion wasn't quite as complete as the biblical account suggests. The psychological mechanisms underlying boanthropy are complex and not fully understood even today. Some cases seem to be triggered by extreme stress, others by underlying neurological conditions, and still others by what appears to be a form of dissociative identity disorder. The patient's mind essentially creates an alternate identity that provides escape from unbearable psychological pressure. For Nebuchadnezzar, the stress of absolute power might have been the triggering factor. The constant pressure of ruling a vast empire, making life and death decisions, and maintaining the facade of divine authority could have created psychological tensions that eventually found release in complete dissociation from human identity. Becoming an animal might have been his mind's way of escaping the overwhelming burden of being a god-king. The treatment options available to ancient Babylonian physicians would have been limited to religious rituals, exorcism, and possibly the use of herbs or potions believed to have magical properties. The concept of talking therapy, medication for mental illness, or even basic psychological support simply didn't exist. The patient would have been seen as either cursed by the gods or possessed by demons, requiring spiritual rather than medical intervention. The eventual recovery described in Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar's sanity returned and he was restored to his throne, suggests that this was episodic rather than a chronic condition. This pattern is consistent with certain types of psychotic disorders that can have periods of complete remission. The fact that he was able to resume his duties as king indicates that his cognitive abilities were not permanently impaired. You're a well-meaning Israelite helping to transport the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. The oxen carrying the sacred chest stumble, and instinctively, you reach out to steady the Ark before it falls. It seems like the right thing to do. After all, you're just trying to protect the most holy object in Israel. But the moment your hand touches the golden surface, something goes catastrophically wrong with your body. You're about to experience what might be the most dramatic case of radiation sickness in biblical history. The biblical account simply states that Uzzah died there by the Ark of God after touching it. But various ancient sources and modern theories suggest the death was both immediate and horrific. Some scholars propose that the Ark of the Covenant might have been constructed with materials or in a way that created electrical conductivity, while others suggest it might have contained radioactive materials that could cause acute radiation syndrome. Imagine the immediate aftermath of your touch. If the Ark was indeed some kind of technological device disguised as a religious artifact, the initial contact might have caused a massive electrical shock that disrupted your nervous system. Your muscles would have contracted violently. Your heart rhythm would have been disrupted, and you might have experienced immediate burns at the point of contact. The smell of burning flesh would have been unmistakable. But if the cause was radioactive materials housed within the Ark, the symptoms would have been different but equally devastating. Acute radiation syndrome begins within hours of exposure and follows a predictable pattern. You would have experienced nausea and vomiting almost immediately, followed by a period of apparent recovery that could last for days or weeks. But internally, your cellular structure would have been rapidly breaking down. The medical understanding of radiation sickness in modern times helps us interpret what ancient witnesses might have seen. The initial symptoms include severe nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and fatigue. But as the radiation damage progresses, the victim's immune system begins to fail. Their blood cells are destroyed, and their body loses the ability to heal itself. The final stages involve massive internal bleeding, organ failure, and death. Ancient observers would have had no framework for understanding radiation sickness. They would have seen someone who appeared to be struck down by divine power, but they wouldn't have understood the mechanism. If Uzzah didn't die immediately, but instead showed the classic progression of radiation syndrome, witnesses would have interpreted his gradual decline as a prolonged divine punishment rather than a medical condition. The specific location of the incident, near the threshing floor of Nachan, becomes significant when we consider the medical implications. If the Ark was indeed radioactive, the area around it would have been contaminated. Other people who spent time near the Ark might have experienced milder symptoms of radiation exposure, including hair loss, skin irritation, and general illness that could be attributed to various causes. The fear that the incident inspired in David and the other witnesses makes more sense when viewed through a medical lens. If they had observed someone die horribly immediately after touching the Ark, their terror wouldn't have been just religious, it would have been practical. They would have recognized that the Ark was genuinely dangerous to human contact, regardless of the theological implications. The construction details of the Ark, provided in Exodus, become particularly interesting when considered from a scientific perspective. The use of gold plating, specific wood types, and the precise measurements could potentially have created some kind of capacitor or electrical device. If the Ark was designed to store electrical energy, accidental contact by someone who wasn't properly grounded could have been fatal. Alternative medical explanations for Uzzah's death include severe allergic reaction to materials used in the Ark's construction, contact with toxic substances that might have been used as preservatives or decorative elements, or even a massive heart attack triggered by the psychological shock of touching the forbidden object. The stress of violating such a fundamental religious taboo could have caused a fatal cardiac event in someone predisposed to heart problems. The aftermath of Uzzah's death had lasting medical implications for how the Ark was handled. David refused to continue transporting it and instead left it at the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. This quarantine period would have been essential if the Ark was indeed radioactive or contaminated with dangerous materials. The fact that Obed-Edom and his household were blessed rather than harmed might indicate that they followed proper safety protocols. When the Ark was finally moved to Jerusalem, the transportation method was completely different. Instead of using an ox cart, the Levites carried it using poles inserted through rings, ensuring that no one came into direct contact with the Ark itself. This change in protocol suggests that the religious authorities had learned from Uzzah's death and recognized the genuine physical danger posed by the artifact. The long-term effects of the incident extended beyond just transportation protocols. The Ark was eventually placed in the Holy of Holies in Solomon's Temple, where it was separated from the general population by multiple barriers and was only approached by the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement. This extreme isolation might have been as much about physical safety as religious sanctity. You're standing in the newly constructed tabernacle, preparing to offer incense to the Lord as you've been trained to do since childhood. You're one of Aaron's sons, part of the newly established priesthood, and you should feel honored to be serving in such a sacred capacity. But you've decided to use strange fire that wasn't taken from the sacred altar, for your incense offering. You have no idea that this decision is about to result in your immediate and violent death from what appears to be spontaneous human combustion. The biblical account states that fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Modern analysis of this incident suggests several possible medical explanations, ranging from flash burns caused by alcohol vapor ignition to electrical discharge from atmospheric conditions. But the most compelling theory involves the spontaneous combustion of alcohol-saturated clothing and tissue. Picture the scene. You and your brother Abihu have been drinking wine before performing your priestly duties. In ancient times, alcohol was commonly consumed during religious ceremonies, and the prohibition against priests drinking before serving wasn't absolute. Your clothing has absorbed alcohol vapors, your breath is heavy with wine, and you're standing near open flames and burning incense. The conditions are perfect for a catastrophic fire. The medical reality of alcohol-related combustion is genuinely terrifying. When alcohol vapor reaches a certain concentration in the air, it becomes highly flammable. A single spark from the incense burner or the sacred fire could ignite the alcohol-saturated environment around you. The flame would spread instantly across your clothing and potentially ignite the alcohol in your bloodstream, causing internal burns that would be immediately fatal. Ancient understanding of fire behavior was limited, but witnesses would have recognized that something unusual had happened. Normal fires spread gradually and can be extinguished with water or by smothering. But alcohol-fed fires burn with intense heat and can appear to consume a human body with shocking speed. The biblical phrase devoured them suggests a rapid, complete consumption that would have been unlike any normal fire. The symptoms of severe alcohol-fed burns would have been immediate and horrific. The intense heat would have caused instant damage to your respiratory system as you inhaled superheated air and alcohol vapor. Your skin would have been seared away in seconds, and the alcohol in your bloodstream would have literally caught fire, causing internal combustion that no ancient medical knowledge could have treated. The psychological impact on witnesses would have been overwhelming. Seeing two priests suddenly burst into flames and be consumed within moments would have seemed like direct divine intervention. The speed and completeness of the destruction would have made it clear that this wasn't an accident or a normal fire. It was something far more terrifying and inexplicable. The medical examination of the bodies would have revealed the unusual nature of their burns. Normal fire victims typically show patterns of damage that indicate attempts to escape or shield themselves. But victims of alcohol-fed combustion often show evidence of being consumed from the inside out, with internal organs more severely damaged than external surfaces. This pattern would have been impossible to explain with ancient medical knowledge. The immediate aftermath of the incident reveals practical medical concerns. Moses instructed Aaron's remaining sons to carry the bodies out of the tabernacle, but he specified that they should be carried by their tunics rather than touched directly. This suggests awareness that the bodies might still be dangerous, either from residual heat or from contamination with whatever had caused the combustion. The prohibition against mourning that was imposed on Aaron might have had medical as well as religious justifications. If the deaths were caused by some form of contamination or toxic exposure, preventing Aaron from having close contact with the bodies would have been a practical safety measure. The rapid burial and the specific instructions about handling the remains suggest awareness of potential ongoing danger. The long-term consequences of this incident extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. New regulations were established prohibiting priests from drinking alcohol before serving in the tabernacle. This wasn't just a religious requirement. It was a practical safety measure designed to prevent similar incidents. The recognition that alcohol and fire were a dangerous combination showed sophisticated understanding of cause and effect. The incident also led to changes in how the sacred fire was maintained and controlled. The requirement that all fire used in religious ceremonies must come from the sacred altar wasn't just about religious purity, it was about fire safety. By controlling the source of all flames in the tabernacle, the priest could better manage the risk of accidental combustion in an environment filled with flammable materials. Modern forensic analysis of similar incidents reveals that alcohol-fed combustion can indeed cause the kind of rapid, complete destruction described in the biblical account. Cases of spontaneous human combustion often involve victims who had been drinking heavily and were in proximity to ignition sources. The combination of alcohol vapor, open flames, and flammable clothing creates conditions where a human body can be consumed with shocking speed. You're standing in the newly constructed Temple of Bethel, raising your hand to make an offering on the altar you've built to compete with the temple in Jerusalem. You're King Jeroboam of Israel, and you've just established a new religious system to prevent your people from traveling to Judah for worship. But a prophet from Judah has appeared and is pronouncing judgment on your altar. In your anger, you stretch out your hand to order his arrest, but something goes horribly wrong. Your hand suddenly withers, becoming paralyzed and useless, and you cannot draw it back to your side. The biblical account describes this as divine judgment, but modern medical analysis suggests several possible conditions that could cause such sudden, dramatic paralysis. The most likely explanation is a severe stroke affecting the motor cortex on one side of the brain, causing immediate and complete paralysis of the affected limb. But other possibilities include acute compartment syndrome, severe muscle spasm, or even a form of conversion disorder triggered by extreme psychological stress. Imagine the medical reality of sudden stroke in the ancient world. You're in the middle of an intense confrontation. Your blood pressure is elevated from anger and stress, and suddenly you feel a sharp pain in your head, followed by complete loss of function in your right arm. The hand that was raised in command suddenly becomes a useless appendage that hangs limp at your side. You try to move it, but the neural pathways that control movement have been severed by the stroke. The symptoms would have been immediately apparent to everyone present. Your hand would have become completely flaccid, unable to grip, point, or perform any voluntary movement. The paralysis would have been accompanied by loss of sensation, so you wouldn't have been able to feel touch, temperature, or pain in the affected limb. The psychological impact of suddenly losing control of a body part would have been overwhelming, especially for a king accustomed to absolute power. Ancient understanding of sudden paralysis was limited and heavily influenced by religious beliefs. The Israelites would have interpreted the timing and circumstances as clear evidence of divine intervention. The fact that the paralysis occurred at the exact moment you were ordering the arrest of a prophet would have seemed like undeniable proof that God was protecting his messenger and punishing the unfaithful king. The medical treatment available to you would have been primitive and largely ineffective. Ancient physicians might have tried massage, heat treatments, or herbal remedies, but they had no understanding of brain function or the complex neural pathways that control movement. They might have attempted to restore function through prayer, sacrifice, or magical rituals, but these would have had no effect on the underlying neurological damage. The description of the hand as withered suggests not just paralysis, but also visible changes in the muscle tissue. In cases of severe stroke or nerve damage, the affected muscles begin to atrophy relatively quickly. Within weeks or months, your hand would have become noticeably smaller and thinner as the muscle tissue wasted away from disuse. The skin might have become pale and cool due to reduced blood circulation. The psychological impact of this condition would have been devastating for a king. Your hands were symbols of your power. You used them to gesture commands, to receive tribute, to perform royal duties. Having one hand become completely useless would have been a constant reminder of your limitations and mortality. Every public appearance would have required you to consciously hide or compensate for your disability. The political implications of visible disability in an ancient monarch were severe. In a world where physical perfection was often associated with divine favor, Having a withered hand would have been seen as evidence that the gods had withdrawn their support. Your enemies would have interpreted the disability as a sign of weakness, and your own subjects might have questioned your fitness to rule. The biblical account mentions that the hand was later restored when Jeroboam requested the prophet to pray for him. From a medical perspective, this could represent several possibilities. If the original condition was caused by severe muscle spasm or psychological factors, recovery might have been possible as the underlying triggers were resolved. Alternatively, the restoration might have been partial improvement that was interpreted as complete healing. The incident had lasting consequences for how physical disability was understood in ancient Israel. The connection between the king's actions and his immediate physical punishment reinforced the belief that illness and disability were often forms of divine judgment. This understanding would have affected how other people with disabilities were perceived and treated in Israelite society. Modern medical knowledge reveals that sudden onset paralysis of a single limb can indeed occur due to various causes. Stroke is the most common, but other possibilities include blood clots, traumatic nerve injury, or even severe anxiety reactions that can cause temporary paralysis. The key factor in the biblical account is the timing, the fact that the paralysis occurred at the moment of attempted violence against a prophet. The description of the restoration process provides additional medical insights. The fact that Jeroboam could request prayer and that the hand was restored suggests that he retained normal cognitive function and speech. This is consistent with a stroke that affected only the motor cortex controlling the hand, leaving other brain functions intact. The restoration might have been due to the brain's ability to develop new neural pathways around damaged areas. You're experiencing what might be the most disgusting death in biblical history. You're Herod the Great, the king who ordered the massacre of the innocents. And now you're lying in your palace at Jericho, slowly being consumed by what appears to be an infestation of worms. But this isn't just any parasitic infection. This is something so revolting that the ancient historians who recorded it could barely bring themselves to describe the full horror of your condition. The Jewish historian Josephus provides the most detailed medical account of Herod's death, describing symptoms that modern physicians recognize as consistent with a condition called Fournier's gangrene, a rapidly spreading infection of the genital and perianal regions that can literally cause the flesh to rot away, while the patient is still alive. The biblical account focuses on the divine justice of the death, but the medical reality was far more gruesome than any theological interpretation. Picture the progression of this disease. It starts with what seems like a minor infection or irritation in your genital area. Perhaps you initially dismiss it as a rash or a small wound that will heal on its own. But within days, the infection begins to spread with alarming speed. The affected tissue becomes swollen, discolored, and begins to emit a foul odor that even the most expensive perfumes cannot mask. The bacterial infection responsible for Fournier's gangrene is particularly aggressive because it produces enzymes that literally dissolve human tissue. As the disease progresses, you would have watched in horror as your own flesh began to rot away, exposing underlying structures that were never meant to be visible. The pain would have been excruciating, but the psychological trauma of watching your body decompose while you were still alive would have been even worse. Ancient physicians would have had no effective treatment for such a condition. They might have tried to clean the wounds with wine or honey, both of which have some antimicrobial properties. But these measures would have been futile against such an aggressive infection. The antibiotics that could save a modern patient with Fournier's gangrene simply didn't exist, making the condition essentially a death sentence. The smell associated with this condition would have been overwhelming. Rotting human flesh produces a distinctive odor that is both nauseating and unmistakable. Your servants would have struggled to remain in the same room, even with generous use of incense and perfumes. The stench would have been a constant reminder of your mortality and the decay of your physical form. Josephus mentions that the infection was accompanied by intense itching and the sensation of worms crawling under the skin. This symptom, known medically as formication, can be caused by the bacterial toxins affecting the nervous system. You would have felt as though insects were constantly moving just beneath the surface of your skin, creating an unbearable urge to scratch that only made the infection worse. The psychological impact of this condition would have been devastating. You were a king who had spent your life accumulating power, wealth, and control over others. But now you were helpless against an infection that was literally eating you alive. The same body that had once been strong enough to lead armies and intimidate enemies was now betraying you in the most fundamental way possible. The medical complications of Fournier's gangrene extend beyond the local infection. The bacterial toxins enter the bloodstream and cause systemic poisoning and affects multiple organs. You would have experienced fever, chills, confusion, and eventually organ failure as your body's systems shut down one by one. The infection was essentially poisoning you from the inside out. The timing of Herod's death, occurring shortly after he had ordered the massacre of the innocents in Bethlehem, created a powerful narrative about divine justice. But the medical reality suggests that the infection had been developing for some time. The stress of ruling a fractured kingdom, combined with the physical demands of ancient life, might have compromised his immune system and made him more susceptible to such infections. The description of worms in the infected tissue might have been literally accurate. Certain types of bacterial infections can create conditions that attract scavenging insects, and fly larvae might have infested the rotting flesh. The sight of actual worms moving through the infected tissue would have been the final horror in an already nightmarish condition. Ancient understanding of infection and disease was limited, but the physicians treating Herod would have recognized that this was not a normal illness. The rapid progression, the distinctive smell, and the tissue destruction would have been unlike anything they had seen before. Their inability to provide effective treatment would have reinforced the belief that this was divine punishment rather than a medical condition. The long-term historical impact of Herod's death extended far beyond the immediate succession crisis. The gruesome nature of his demise became part of the cultural memory of divine justice, reinforcing the belief that those who committed atrocities against the innocent would face appropriate punishment. The medical details of his death served as a powerful reminder of human mortality and the limits of earthly power. You're wandering in the wilderness of Sinai, and you've been complaining about the food, the water, and the endless journey that seems to have no destination. You're tired, thirsty, and frustrated with Moses' leadership. But suddenly, something moves in the sand near your feet, something that glints like metal in the desert sun. Before you can react, fangs pierce your ankle, and a burning sensation unlike anything you've ever experienced begins to spread up your leg. You've just been bitten by one of the fiery serpents that God has sent as punishment for the Israelites' complaints. The Hebrew word seraph, used to describe these serpents, literally means burning, and it refers to the intense fiery pain caused by their bite. Modern herpetologists studying the fauna of the Sinai Peninsula have identified several species of venomous snakes that could match this description, including the saw-scaled viper and the carpet viper. These snakes produce hemotoxic venom that causes exactly the kind of burning sensation described in the biblical account. Imagine the immediate aftermath of the bite. The initial pain is like being stabbed with a red-hot poker, but this is just the beginning. Within minutes, the venom begins to break down your blood vessels, causing massive internal bleeding and swelling. The bite site becomes hot and inflamed, giving the impression that you're literally burning from the inside out. Your skin takes on a reddish hue as blood vessels rupture just beneath the surface. The medical progression of hemotoxic envenomation is relentless and terrifying. The venom contains enzymes that destroy red blood cells, disrupt clotting mechanisms, and cause widespread tissue damage. You would have experienced nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea as your body tried to eliminate the toxins. Your blood pressure would have dropped dramatically, leading to shock and potentially cardiac arrest. Ancient understanding of snake bites was limited but practical. The Israelites would have recognized that certain snakes were deadly and that their bites caused rapid death. However, they had no knowledge of venom composition, antitoxins, or the complex biochemical processes that make snake bites so dangerous. Their treatment methods were largely limited to folk remedies and religious practices. The biblical account mentions that much people of Israel died from these snake bites, suggesting that the envenomation was occurring on a massive scale. In a population already weakened by years of desert wandering, poor nutrition, and limited medical care, even moderately venomous snake bites could have been fatal. The combination of dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure to extreme temperatures would have made the effects of envenomation even more severe. The symptoms described in various ancient sources paint a picture of horrible suffering. Victims would have experienced intense thirst as their blood volume decreased due to internal bleeding. The burning sensation would have spread throughout their bodies as the venom continued to destroy tissue. Many would have died from shock or cardiac arrest within hours of being bitten. The psychological impact of this plague would have been overwhelming. Unlike other forms of punishment that might be interpreted as natural disasters, snake bites were clearly connected to the reptiles that had suddenly appeared in unprecedented numbers. The survivors would have lived in constant fear of stepping on another serpent, making every movement through the desert a potential death sentence. The treatment methods available to the Israelites were primitive and largely ineffective. They might have tried to suck out the venom, apply heated stones to the bite site, or use various herbs and poultices. Some of these treatments might have provided minor relief, but none would have been effective against the massive tissue damage and systemic poisoning caused by hemotoxic venom. The biblical solution to the snake plague was the creation of a bronze serpent on a pole, which people could look at and be healed. From a medical perspective, this might have served as a form of psychological treatment that helped victims cope with their fear and pain. The belief that they could be healed by looking at the bronze serpent might have provided enough mental relief to help them survive bites that weren't immediately fatal. The long-term effects of surviving snakebite envenomation would have been severe. Those who didn't die immediately might have suffered from permanent tissue damage, scarring, and potentially loss of limbs due to necrosis. The psychological trauma of experiencing such intense pain and coming close to death would have left lasting mental scars on the survivors. Modern medical understanding reveals that the fiery serpents were likely real snakes whose behavior was influenced by environmental factors. During certain seasons or weather conditions, normally reclusive species might become more active and aggressive. The combination of increased snake activity and a large population of humans traveling through their territory could have created the conditions for a widespread envenomation event. The description of the serpents as fiery might also refer to their appearance rather than just the effects of their bite. Some desert snakes have scales that reflect light in a way that makes them appear to glow or shimmer, especially in the intense sunlight of the Sinai Desert. This visual effect, combined with the burning sensation of their bite, would have made the fiery serpent designation particularly appropriate. You're sitting at a dinner party in the house of a prominent Pharisee, and you're suffering from what ancient physicians call dropsy, a condition that has caused your body to swell with fluid until you look like a grotesque parody of your former self. Every step is agony, every breath is labored, and your skin is stretched so tight that you fear it might burst. You've come to this gathering not for the food or fellowship, but because you've heard that a controversial healer named Jesus will be there, and you're desperate enough to risk public humiliation for a chance at healing. The medical condition known as dropsy in biblical times is what we now call edema or fluid retention, often caused by congestive heart failure, kidney disease, or liver dysfunction. But the ancient understanding of this condition was completely different from modern medical knowledge. Ancient physicians believed that dropsy was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors or by the accumulation of cold, moist substances in the body that needed to be expelled through various treatments. Picture the physical reality of severe edema. Your legs are so swollen that your skin appears translucent, and you compress your finger into the flesh and leave a deep indentation that remains for several minutes. Your abdomen is distended with fluid, making it difficult to bend over or find a comfortable position to sleep. Your face is puffy and unrecognizable, and even your hands are so swollen that you can't make a proper fist or grip objects normally. The social stigma associated with dropsy in ancient times was severe. People believed that the condition was often a punishment for sin or a sign of moral corruption. Your grotesque appearance would have made you a subject of whispers and pointing, and many people would have avoided you entirely, either from disgust or from fear that the condition might be contagious. Attending a dinner party in your condition would have been seen as presumptuous and potentially offensive to the other guests. The underlying medical causes of dropsy were numerous and often fatal in the ancient world. Congestive heart failure was common due to rheumatic heart disease, dietary deficiencies, and the physical demands of ancient life. Kidney disease could result from infections, parasites, or toxins. Liver dysfunction might be caused by malnutrition, alcohol abuse, or infectious diseases. Without modern diagnostic tools, physicians had no way to determine the underlying cause of the fluid retention. Ancient treatments for dropsy were varied and often dangerous. Physicians might prescribe diuretic herbs to increase urine production, but these could cause dangerous dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. They might recommend bloodletting to remove excess fluid, which could actually worsen the condition by reducing blood volume. Some treatments involved puncturing the swollen tissue to allow fluid to drain, but this often led to serious infections. The symptoms you would have experienced went far beyond just a visible swelling. The excess fluid would have put pressure on your lungs, making breathing difficult and causing you to feel constantly short of breath. The swelling in your legs and feet would have made walking painful and exhausting. You might have experienced palpitations as your heart struggled to pump blood through your fluid-logged circulatory system. The psychological impact of dropsy was devastating. The gradual transformation of your body into something grotesque and unfamiliar would have been deeply traumatic. You would have watched helplessly as your physical form changed beyond recognition, affecting not just your appearance, but your ability to perform basic daily activities. The knowledge that dropsy was often progressive and fatal would have added despair to your physical suffering. The biblical account of Jesus healing the man with dropsy emphasizes the timing. It occurred on the Sabbath, creating a controversy about whether healing work was permissible on the day of rest. But from a medical perspective, the healing would have been immediately apparent to everyone present. The rapid reduction of swelling, the restoration of normal breathing, and the obvious relief of the patient would have been impossible to fake or attribute to natural causes. The mechanism of such a healing, if it occurred as described, would have required immediate and dramatic changes in the patient's cardiovascular and renal function. The excess fluid would have needed to be rapidly eliminated from the body, either through increased urine production or through some other mechanism. The underlying cause of the fluid retention would have had to be corrected instantly, whether it was heart failure, kidney disease, or liver dysfunction. The long-term implications of healing from dropsy would have been profound. If the underlying condition was indeed cured rather than just temporarily relieved, the patient would have experienced a complete transformation of their quality of life. The ability to breathe normally, walk without pain, and appear normal in public would have been like being restored from the dead. The psychological relief of being freed from a condition that was often considered a death sentence would have been overwhelming. Modern medical understanding reveals that severe edema can indeed be reversed rapidly with appropriate treatment. Powerful diuretics can remove excess fluid within hours, and treating the underlying cause can provide long-term relief. However, the complete and instantaneous healing described in the biblical account would still be considered medically extraordinary, requiring correction of complex underlying pathological processes that normally take time to resolve. The social implications of such a healing would have extended far beyond the individual patient. In a society where physical condition was often interpreted as a reflection of spiritual state, the dramatic healing of dropsy would have been seen as evidence of divine power and favor. The timing of the healing on the Sabbath would have challenged conventional understanding of religious law and divine will. You're living in one of the Philistine cities when the Ark of the Covenant arrives as a trophy of war, and within days, something horrifying begins to happen to your body. Small, hard lumps start appearing under your skin. First just one or two, then dozens, then hundreds. They're painful, they're growing larger each day, and they're appearing in the most embarrassing and uncomfortable places imaginable. You're experiencing what biblical scholars believe was an epidemic of bubonic plague, complete with the characteristic swellings that would later terrorize medieval Europe. The Hebrew word charm, used in the biblical account, has been translated various ways, but medical historians increasingly believe it refers to buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that are the hallmark of bubonic plague. These swellings typically appear in the groin, armpits, and neck, and they can grow to the size of eggs or even larger. The pain associated with buboes is excruciating, and their appearance is a sign that the plague bacteria have overwhelmed your lymphatic system. Imagine the medical reality of bubonic plague in an ancient city. You wake up one morning feeling feverish and exhausted, with what seems like a small, tender lump in your groin. But by the next day, the lump has doubled in size and is so painful that you can barely walk. More lumps are appearing under your arms and on your neck, and you're beginning to experience the classic symptoms of systemic infection: high fever, chills, headache, and overwhelming fatigue. The progression of bubonic plague is relentless and terrifying. The bacteria Yersinia pestis, typically transmitted by fleas from infected rodents, multiplies rapidly in your lymph nodes, causing the characteristic swellings. But the infection doesn't stop there. It spreads through your bloodstream, causing septicemia that can affect every organ in your body. Without modern antibiotics, the mortality rate for bubonic plague is 50 to 60%, rising to nearly 100% if it progresses to pneumonic plague. Ancient physicians would have had no understanding of bacterial infections or the role of fleas and rodents in disease transmission. They would have seen the sudden appearance of painful swellings throughout the population and interpreted it as divine punishment or some form of supernatural affliction. The treatments they offered would have been not only ineffective but potentially harmful, including bloodletting, purging, and the application of various poultices and herbal remedies. The biblical account mentions that the plague affected not just humans, but also caused tumors to appear in the secret parts of the affected population. This detail is consistent with bubonic plague, which often causes buboes to develop in the inguinal region, the lymph nodes in the groin area. The location of these swellings would have been particularly embarrassing and would have made the condition even more distressing for the victims. The psychological impact of bubonic plague would have been devastating. The sudden appearance of painful growing lumps on your body would have been terrifying enough. But the knowledge that similar symptoms were appearing throughout your city would have created mass panic. The rapid progression of the disease, from initial symptoms to death in just days, would have made it clear that this was no ordinary illness. The social disruption caused by the plague would have been enormous. As more and more people became ill, normal city functions would have broken down. Trade would have stopped, religious ceremonies would have been disrupted, and the basic social order would have collapsed as people either fled the city or barricaded themselves in their homes. The smell of death would have permeated the air as bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. The biblical narrative indicates that the Philistines recognized a connection between the presence of the ark and the outbreak of the plague. From a modern perspective, this correlation might not be coincidental. The ark might have been transported in conditions that facilitated the spread of plague-infected fleas. Alternatively, the stress and disruption caused by the military campaign that captured the ark might have created conditions unfavorable for plague transmission. The medical complications of bubonic plague extend far beyond the characteristic buboes. As the infection progresses, victims experience severe systemic symptoms including delirium, difficulty breathing, and bleeding from various body openings. The plague bacteria produce toxins that cause widespread tissue damage and organ failure. Even those who survive the initial infection might suffer from permanent complications including scarring, tissue damage, and cognitive impairment. The ancient treatment methods available to the Philistines would have been completely ineffective against bacterial infection. They might have tried to lance the buboes to release the infected material, but this would have been not only painful but potentially dangerous, as it could spread the infection to new sites. Herbal remedies, prayer, and various magical practices would have provided no relief against the relentless progression of the plague. The timing and geography of the plague outbreak, moving from city to city as the ark was relocated, suggests that the epidemic followed predictable patterns of disease transmission. If the plague was indeed bubonic plague, it would have been spread by infected fleas that traveled with the ark, or by rats that followed the same routes. The fact that each city experienced the plague shortly after receiving the ark supports this interpretation. The eventual resolution of the plague, which occurred when the Philistines returned the ark to the Israelites along with golden replicas of their tumors, might have coincided with the natural end of the epidemic. Bubonic plague outbreaks typically burn themselves out when they exhaust the population of susceptible hosts, or when environmental conditions become unfavorable for flea transmission. You're the aging King Asa of Judah, and something is eating away at your feet from the inside. What started as minor discomfort has progressed to excruciating pain that makes every step agony. Your feet are becoming twisted and deformed, and you can feel your strength ebbing away with each passing day. The biblical account describes your condition as disease in his feet, but medical historians believe you were suffering from what we now recognize as severe diabetes, with its characteristic complications of gangrene and peripheral neuropathy. The progression of diabetic complications in the ancient world would have been particularly devastating because there was no understanding of blood sugar, insulin, or the complex metabolic processes that cause diabetes. Your condition would have begun subtly, perhaps with increased thirst, frequent urination, and unexplained weight loss. But these early symptoms would have been easily dismissed as signs of aging or stress, rather than indicators of a serious metabolic disorder. Imagine the medical reality of diabetic foot complications in biblical times. The high blood sugar levels would have damaged your blood vessels and nerves, reducing circulation to your feet and eliminating your ability to feel injuries or infections. Small cuts or blisters that would heal quickly in a healthy person would have become infected and refused to heal. The infections would have spread deeper into the tissue, causing the characteristic rotting smell of gangrene. The ancient understanding of such a condition would have been limited to observing the visible symptoms without any knowledge of the underlying causes. Your physicians would have seen the swelling, discoloration, and eventual tissue death in your feet, but they would have had no way to connect these symptoms to problems with your metabolism or blood sugar levels. They might have attributed the condition to bad blood, poisoning, or divine punishment. The pain associated with diabetic neuropathy would have been constant and severe. You would have experienced burning sensations, stabbing pains, and the feeling of needles being driven into your feet. The pain would have been worse at night, making sleep nearly impossible. As the condition progressed, you might have lost sensation in your feet entirely, making it difficult to walk safely or maintain your balance. The biblical account specifically mentions that Asa's disease was in his feet, and that it was exceeding great, suggesting that the condition was severe and progressive. This description is consistent with diabetic gangrene, which typically affects the extremities first and can spread rapidly if untreated. The fact that the condition was described as being in both feet suggests bilateral involvement, which is characteristic of diabetic complications. The treatment methods available to ancient physicians would have been not only ineffective, but potentially harmful. They might have tried to remove dead tissue with crude instruments, increasing the risk of infection. They might have applied various poultices or herbal remedies that could have introduced additional bacteria. Some treatments might have involved cauterization with hot metals, which would have caused additional tissue damage. The psychological impact of watching your feet slowly rot away would have been devastating. As a king, you would have been accustomed to physical strength and mobility. The gradual loss of your ability to walk, combined with the constant pain and the knowledge that your condition was progressive, would have created profound depression and anxiety. The visual and olfactory evidence of your body's decay would have been a constant reminder of your mortality. The biblical narrative suggests that Asa's condition was connected to his failure to seek God's help, instead relying only on physicians. This theological interpretation reflects the ancient understanding that serious illness was often a form of divine punishment. However, the specific mention of physicians suggests that he did receive medical treatment, even though it was ultimately unsuccessful. The social implications of a king suffering from such a visible and debilitating condition would have been severe. In a culture where physical perfection was associated with divine favor, having feet that were visibly diseased and malodorous would have been seen as evidence of loss of divine support. Your enemies might have interpreted your condition as a sign of weakness, and even your supporters might have questioned your fitness to rule. The progression of diabetic complications would have affected more than just your feet. You might have experienced vision problems as high blood sugar damaged the blood vessels in your eyes. Your kidneys would have been under stress, potentially causing fluid retention and cardiovascular problems. Your immune system would have been compromised, making you susceptible to infections throughout your body. The biblical account indicates that Asa died from his disease, which is consistent with the prognosis for severe diabetic complications in the ancient world. Without insulin, antibiotics, or modern wound care, diabetic gangrene was essentially a death sentence. The infection would have spread throughout your body, causing sepsis and multiple organ failure. Modern medical understanding reveals that the symptoms described in the biblical account are entirely consistent with type 2 diabetes and its complications. The focus on the feet, the progressive nature of the condition, and the ultimate fatal outcome all match the typical progression of diabetic complications in an untreated patient. The fact that the condition affected an older king who would have had access to rich foods and a sedentary lifestyle makes the diagnosis even more plausible. You're King Joram of Judah, and your intestines are literally rotting inside your body. What started as occasional stomach discomfort has progressed to constant, excruciating pain accompanied by bloody diarrhea that leaves you weak and dehydrated. The biblical account describes how your bowels fell out due to an incurable disease, and medical historians believe you were suffering from what might have been inflammatory bowel disease, colon cancer, or a severe parasitic infection that literally consumed your intestinal tract. The Hebrew phrase used to describe your condition suggests a prolonged illness that specifically targeted your digestive system. The symptoms would have begun gradually, perhaps with changes in your bowel habits, occasional abdominal pain, and the appearance of blood in your stool. But over the course of 2 years, as the biblical account specifies, the condition would have progressed relentlessly until your intestinal system was completely destroyed. Imagine the medical reality of severe inflammatory bowel disease in the ancient world. Your intestinal lining would have been chronically inflamed, causing painful ulcers that bled constantly. The inflammation would have made it impossible for your body to absorb nutrients properly, leading to severe malnutrition despite having access to royal food. The constant bloody diarrhea would have left you perpetually dehydrated and weak. The pain associated with such a condition would have been excruciating and constant. You would have experienced cramping, burning sensations, and the feeling that your abdomen was being twisted from the inside. The pain would have been particularly severe during bowel movements, which would have occurred frequently throughout the day and night. Sleep would have been nearly impossible, and even the simplest daily activities would have become overwhelming challenges. Ancient physicians would have had no understanding of the complex inflammatory processes that cause conditions like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. They would have seen the blood in your stool and the obvious signs of your deteriorating health, but they would have been unable to provide any effective treatment. Their remedies might have included dietary changes, herbal preparations, or various magical practices, but none would have addressed the underlying autoimmune or inflammatory processes. The biblical account mentions that the disease was incurable and that it lasted exactly 2 years before resulting in death. This timeline is consistent with several serious intestinal conditions that can have a progressive course leading to complete bowel failure. The specificity of the 2-year duration suggests that the condition followed a predictable pattern of deterioration that was observable to those caring for the king. The description of the bowels falling out might refer to severe rectal prolapse, a condition where the intestinal tissue protrudes from the rectum due to chronic inflammation and weakness of the surrounding muscles. This would have been not only extremely painful, but also visually horrifying for both the patient and those who witnessed it. The psychological trauma of having your internal organs literally visible outside your body would have been overwhelming. The social implications of such a condition for a reigning monarch would have been severe. Kings were expected to project strength and divine favor, but having a condition that involved constant bloody diarrhea and visible intestinal prolapse would have made it impossible to maintain royal dignity. The smell alone would have made public appearances difficult, and the obvious signs of your physical deterioration would have been interpreted as loss of divine support. The nutritional consequences of severe intestinal disease would have been catastrophic. Your body would have been unable to absorb essential nutrients, leading to severe malnutrition, anemia, and muscle wasting. You would have lost significant weight. Your skin would have become pale and sallow, and you would have experienced constant fatigue. The combination of malnutrition and chronic blood loss would have made you extremely vulnerable to infections and other complications. The biblical narrative suggests that this illness was divine punishment for Jeram's evil deeds, including his marriage to Athaliah, daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, and his promotion of idol worship. The connection between moral behavior and physical health was a fundamental aspect of ancient Hebrew understanding of disease. The specific targeting of the digestive system might have been seen as particularly appropriate punishment for someone who had corrupted the spiritual diet of his people. The treatment methods available to ancient physicians would have been completely inadequate for such a severe condition. They might have tried to control the diarrhea with binding agents, but this could have made the condition worse by preventing the elimination of toxins. They might have attempted to improve nutrition with special foods, but a severely inflamed intestinal tract would have been unable to absorb nutrients regardless of what was consumed. The psychological impact of watching your body slowly destroy itself from the inside would have been devastating. The constant pain, the humiliation of your bodily functions becoming uncontrollable, and the knowledge that your condition was progressive and incurable would have created profound despair. The fact that this was happening to a king who was accustomed to absolute control over his environment would have made the psychological trauma even more severe. Modern medical understanding reveals that the symptoms described in the biblical account are consistent with several serious intestinal conditions. Inflammatory bowel disease, particularly Crohn's disease, can cause exactly the kind of progressive intestinal destruction described. Colon cancer could also cause similar symptoms, especially if it led to severe inflammation and infection. The 2-year timeline and the ultimately fatal outcome are consistent with either diagnosis in an untreated patient. You're standing in Jerusalem when the destroying angel passes overhead, and within hours, something invisible and deadly begins to spread through the city. People are dropping dead in the streets, not from violence or visible injury, but from what appears to be a rapidly spreading plague that kills with shocking efficiency. You're witnessing the aftermath of King David's census, and the divine punishment is taking the form of a pestilence that will claim 70,000 lives in just 3 days. The Hebrew word, Deber, used to describe this plague, typically refers to a highly contagious and rapidly fatal disease. Most likely what we would recognize today as bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, or possibly a hemorrhagic fever like Ebola. The speed and scale of the mortality, 70,000 deaths in 3 days across Israel, suggests a pathogen with an extremely high transmission rate and case fatality rate. Imagine being in Jerusalem during those 3 days of plague. You wake up on the first morning to find that your neighbor has died during the night, apparently healthy when he went to bed, but dead by dawn. By midday, several more people on your street have succumbed, and by evening, the smell of death is beginning to permeate the air. The streets that were bustling with normal activity just hours ago are now filled with the sounds of wailing and the sight of hastily prepared funeral pyres. The medical reality of such a rapidly spreading epidemic would have been nightmarish. If the plague was pneumonic plague, it would have spread through respiratory droplets, making every conversation, every breath, potentially deadly. The symptoms would have included high fever, difficulty breathing, and the coughing up of blood. Death would have occurred within 24 to 48 hours of the onset of symptoms, making it impossible to provide care or even properly isolate the sick. Ancient understanding of epidemic disease was limited to observing the visible effects without comprehending the mechanisms of transmission. People would have noticed that the disease spread from person to person, but they would have attributed this to bad air, divine wrath, or the influence of evil spirits. The concept of microscopic pathogens wouldn't emerge for thousands of years, leaving ancient populations helpless against epidemic diseases. The biblical account specifies that the plague was stopped when it reached the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, where David built an altar and offered sacrifices. From a medical perspective, this might have coincided with the natural end of the epidemic. Many plague outbreaks burn themselves out when they exhaust the population of susceptible hosts or when environmental conditions become unfavorable for transmission. The social disruption caused by such massive mortality would have been complete. Normal economic activity would have ceased as people either fled the affected areas or barricaded themselves in their homes. The infrastructure for disposing of the dead would have been overwhelmed, leading to the kind of mass burial or burning that could actually worsen the epidemic by concentrating infected materials. The psychological impact on survivors would have been profound. Witnessing the deaths of 70,000 people in 3 days would have created mass trauma that would have affected the entire population. The randomness of who lived and who died would have seemed to support the interpretation that this was divine punishment rather than natural disease. The speed of the plague would have made it impossible to provide normal comfort or care to the dying. The biblical narrative connects the plague directly to David's decision to conduct a census of his military forces, interpreting the epidemic as divine punishment for the king's pride and lack of faith. The theological explanation provided a framework for understanding the otherwise inexplicable suffering, but it also created the possibility that the plague could be stopped through appropriate religious action. The geographical scope of the plague, affecting the entire territory of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, suggests either a pathogen that spread naturally across the region or multiple simultaneous outbreaks that appeared to be connected. The fact that the plague stopped at Jerusalem, at the specific location where David offered sacrifice, would have seemed to confirm the religious interpretation of the event. The casualties among different populations would have varied depending on their exposure and susceptibility. Urban areas with higher population density would have experienced more rapid transmission, while rural areas might have been partially protected by isolation. The elderly, children, and those with compromised immune systems would have been particularly vulnerable, but a truly virulent plague would have affected all age groups. The economic consequences of losing 70,000 people in 3 days would have been catastrophic for the kingdom. This would have represented a significant portion of the adult male population, including farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, and administrators. The loss of so many productive members of society would have had long-lasting effects on the kingdom's ability to function effectively. Modern epidemiological analysis reveals that the scale and speed of mortality described in the biblical account is consistent with several known pathogens. Pneumonic plague, in particular, can cause exactly this kind of rapid, widespread mortality in a population with no previous exposure. The 3-day timeline suggests a pathogen with a very short incubation period and high transmissibility. The medical infrastructure of ancient Israel would have been completely overwhelmed by such an epidemic. There were no hospitals, no systematic medical training, and no understanding of infection control. The few physicians available would have been as vulnerable to the disease as anyone else, and their treatments would have been ineffective against bacterial or viral infections. You're Miriam, the sister of Moses, and you've just criticized your brother's leadership along with Aaron. But within moments of your complaint, something horrifying begins to happen to your skin. It starts as a slight tingling sensation, then quickly progresses to visible patches of white, scaly skin that spread across your body with alarming speed. You're experiencing what the biblical text calls leprous, white as snow, a condition that transforms you into a living reminder of the consequences of challenging divinely appointed authority. The Hebrew word zarath, used to describe Miriam's condition, is often translated as leprosy, but modern medical analysis suggests it was more likely a severe form of psoriasis. Vitiligo, or another dermatological condition that causes dramatic changes in skin pigmentation and texture. The key feature mentioned in the biblical account, the sudden onset of white, scaly skin, is more consistent with these conditions than with Hansen's disease, true leprosy. Imagine the medical reality of sudden onset severe psoriasis. Your skin would have become inflamed, hot, and covered with thick silvery scales that flaked off constantly. The affected areas would have been intensely itchy, but scratching would have only made the condition worse and could have led to secondary bacterial infections. The scaling would have been so severe that you would have left a trail of dead skin cells wherever you went. The psychological impact of such a sudden and dramatic change in your appearance would have been devastating. You were a respected leader among the Israelites, a prophetess who had played a crucial role in the exodus from Egypt. But now you were transformed into someone whose appearance was so disturbing that even your own brothers couldn't bear to look at you. The condition would have made you an immediate social outcast. Ancient understanding of sudden skin changes was heavily influenced by religious beliefs. The Israelites would have seen the timing of your condition occurring immediately after you criticized Moses as clear evidence of divine punishment. The specific nature of the skin changes, turning white and scaly, would have been interpreted as a sign of spiritual corruption made visible on your physical body. The biblical account describes Aaron's reaction to seeing Miriam's condition, begging Moses not to lay this sin upon us and comparing her appearance to that of a stillborn child whose flesh is half consumed. This description suggests that the condition was not just cosmetically disturbing, but genuinely horrifying to witness. The comparison to dead flesh indicates that the skin changes were severe enough to make her appear lifeless or partially decomposed. The medical progression of severe psoriasis can indeed be rapid and dramatic. What starts as small patches of red, inflamed skin can spread to cover large areas of the body within days or weeks. The scales that form are composed of dead skin cells that accumulate faster than they can be shed naturally. The condition can be intensely uncomfortable, causing pain, itching, and a constant feeling of tightness in the affected skin. The social implications of such a condition in ancient Israel would have been severe. People with visible skin diseases were often considered ritually unclean and were excluded from normal social interactions. Miriam would have been unable to participate in religious ceremonies, prepare food for others, or even maintain normal family relationships. The isolation would have been complete and immediate. The treatment methods available to ancient physicians would have been limited and largely ineffective. They might have tried various oils, herbal preparations, or mineral baths, but they would have had no understanding of the autoimmune processes that cause psoriasis or the genetic factors that make some people more susceptible to these conditions. Most treatments would have focused on managing symptoms rather than addressing underlying causes. The biblical narrative indicates that Miriam's condition was healed after 7 days of isolation outside the camp, following Moses' prayer for her recovery. This timeline is interesting from a medical perspective, as it suggests either a temporary condition that resolved naturally or psychosomatic element that responded to the resolution of the underlying conflict that had triggered the outbreak. The requirement for 7 days of isolation outside the camp served multiple purposes. From a medical standpoint, it allowed time to determine whether the condition was contagious and whether it would resolve on its own. From a social perspective, it provided a period of public humiliation that reinforced the consequences of challenging religious authority. From a psychological standpoint, it gave Miriam time to reflect on her actions and their consequences. The description of the skin as white as snow is particularly significant because it suggests complete depigmentation rather than just scaling. This could indicate vitiligo, a condition where the immune system attacks the cells that produce skin pigment, resulting in patches of completely white skin. The combination of scaling and depigmentation would have created a particularly striking and disturbing appearance. Modern dermatological understanding reveals that stress can indeed trigger the onset of various skin conditions, including psoriasis and vitiligo. The psychological stress of the confrontation with Moses, combined with the social pressure of challenging established authority, could have been sufficient to trigger an autoimmune response that manifested as severe skin changes. The long-term effects of such an episode would have extended beyond just the physical healing. Miriam's temporary transformation would have served as a powerful reminder to the entire Israelite community about the consequences of challenging divinely appointed leadership. The visual impact of seeing a respected leader suddenly struck down with a horrifying skin condition would have created lasting psychological impressions. The medical aspects of Miriam's condition also highlight the complex relationship between physical and spiritual health in ancient Hebrew understanding. The immediate onset of the condition following her criticism of Moses and its resolution following prayer and repentance reinforced the belief that moral and spiritual behavior had direct consequences for physical health. You're lying in bed in Capernaum, and your body is burning with fever that seems to consume you from the inside out. Every muscle aches, your head throbs with pain, and you're barely conscious of the activity around you. You're the mother-in-law of Simon Peter, and your condition is so severe that your family has called for the local physician. But nothing they've tried has been able to break the fever that's threatening to claim your life. This is the kind of fever that kills quickly in the ancient world, where medical knowledge is limited and effective treatments are non-existent. The fever described in the biblical account was serious enough to confine you to bed and require immediate medical attention. In the ancient world, fever was both a symptom and a disease category in itself. Without modern understanding of infection, immune responses, or the role of fever in fighting disease, ancient physicians treated fever as a condition that needed to be eliminated, rather than a natural defense mechanism that sometimes needed to be managed. Imagine the medical reality of severe fever in first-century Palestine. Your body temperature would have been dangerously elevated, possibly reaching 104 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. At this temperature, your brain function would have been impaired, causing confusion, delirium, and potentially hallucinations. Your heart would have been racing as it tried to pump blood through your overheated body, and you would have been sweating profusely, leading to dangerous dehydration. The underlying cause of your fever could have been any number of infectious diseases common in the ancient Mediterranean world. Malaria was endemic in many areas and could cause the kind of high fever that would confine someone to bed. Typhoid fever was another possibility, spread through contaminated water and food. Pneumonia, caused by bacterial or viral infections, could also produce the severe fever described in the biblical account. Ancient physicians would have tried various treatments to reduce your fever, most of which would have been ineffective or potentially harmful. They might have used cold water applications, which could have provided temporary relief, but might have also caused dangerous temperature fluctuations. They might have prescribed bloodletting, believing that removing hot blood would cool the body, but this would have actually weakened you further and made recovery more difficult. The biblical account emphasizes the immediacy and completeness of your healing when Jesus touched your hand. From a medical perspective, this kind of instant recovery from severe fever would have been immediately apparent to everyone present. Your temperature would have returned to normal instantly. Your consciousness would have cleared, and you would have had enough strength to get up and serve your guests, something that would have been impossible moments before. The social implications of your illness would have been significant in the context of ancient Jewish household management. As the mother-in-law in Peter's household, you would have been responsible for food preparation, household management, and hospitality. Your illness would have disrupted the normal functioning of the household and would have prevented the family from properly receiving guests, including Jesus and his disciples. The symptoms associated with severe fever would have been multiple and distressing. Beyond the elevated temperature, you would have experienced severe headache, muscle and joint pain, nausea, and possibly vomiting. Your appetite would have been completely gone, and you would have been too weak to consume the fluids necessary to prevent dehydration. The combination of fever and dehydration would have created a dangerous cycle that could have been fatal without intervention. The timing of your healing, occurring in the context of Jesus' ministry in Capernaum, would have had significant impact on the local community. Word of such a dramatic healing would have spread quickly through the small town, and the fact that you were able to immediately resume your household duties would have provided undeniable evidence of the healing's effectiveness. This would have contributed to Jesus' growing reputation as a healer. The biblical narrative notes that after being healed, you immediately began serving Jesus and his disciples. This detail is medically significant because it demonstrates that your recovery was complete and immediate. Someone recovering from severe fever would normally require days or weeks of gradual recovery, but your ability to resume normal activities immediately suggests that the underlying cause of the fever was completely eliminated. The psychological impact of such a dramatic recovery would have been profound. Going from the delirium and weakness of severe fever to complete health in an instant would have been a life-changing experience. The recognition that you had been healed through divine intervention would have created a sense of gratitude and obligation that would have influenced the rest of your life. Modern medical understanding reveals that fever is typically a symptom of underlying infection or inflammation rather than a disease in itself. The rapid resolution of fever would indicate that whatever pathogen or condition was causing the immune response was immediately eliminated. This kind of instant recovery is virtually unknown in modern medicine, where even effective treatments typically take time to resolve fever completely. The description of the healing emphasizes the physical touch involved. Jesus took your hand and helped you up. This detail suggests that the healing involved not just the resolution of fever, but also the restoration of physical strength and coordination. Severe fever often leaves patients weak and unsteady even after the temperature returns to normal, but your immediate ability to stand and serve indicates complete restoration of normal function. The long-term implications of your healing would have extended beyond just your personal recovery. As a member of Peter's household, your experience would have been one of the early demonstrations of Jesus' healing power that helped establish his reputation and credibility. The fact that the healing occurred in a domestic setting, witnessed by Jesus' closest disciples, would have made it particularly significant in the development of their faith and understanding of his mission. You're sitting in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and your right hand, the hand you once used to work, to write, to embrace your children, hangs useless at your side. The muscles have atrophied. The fingers are curled into a claw-like position, and the entire limb has become a constant reminder of your disability and social marginalization. You're the man with the withered hand, and your condition has made you not just physically impaired, but also religiously suspect in a culture that often interpreted disability as evidence of sin or divine disfavor. The Greek word zerino, used to describe your condition, suggests a hand that has dried up or become desiccated, indicating severe muscle atrophy and loss of function. Modern medical analysis suggests several possible causes for such a condition, including stroke, nerve damage, muscular dystrophy, or a congenital condition that had worsened over time. The specific mention of the right hand is significant because this was the dominant hand for most people, making the disability even more debilitating. Imagine the daily reality of living with a withered hand in ancient Palestine. Every simple task, eating, dressing, working, would have required adaptation and struggle. You would have been unable to perform most types of manual labor, severely limiting your economic opportunities. In a society where physical capability was closely tied to social status and self-sufficiency, your disability would have relegated you to dependency on others for basic survival. The medical progression of hand atrophy can be gradual or sudden, depending on the underlying cause. If it was caused by stroke, the onset might have been rapid, with the hand becoming paralyzed and then gradually wasting away as the muscles received no neural stimulation. If it was due to a progressive muscular condition, you might have watched helplessly as your hand slowly lost strength and functionality over months or years. Ancient understanding of muscular atrophy was limited to observing the visible effects without comprehending the underlying neurological or muscular processes. Physicians might have attributed your condition to poor circulation, an imbalance of bodily humors, or supernatural causes. The treatments available would have been largely ineffective, perhaps massage, heat applications, or various herbal remedies that would have provided no real benefit. The biblical account emphasizes that your healing occurred in the synagogue on the Sabbath, creating a controversy about whether healing work was permissible on the day of rest. But from a medical perspective, the restoration of your hand would have been immediately and dramatically apparent to everyone present. The muscle mass would have returned, the fingers would have straightened, and you would have regained full strength and coordination instantly. The social implications of your disability would have been severe in ancient Jewish society. You would have been limited in your ability to participate in certain religious activities, unable to perform many types of work, and possibly viewed with suspicion by those who believed disability was connected to sin. The synagogue, where your healing occurred, might have been one of the few places where you could still participate in community life despite your disability. The psychological impact of living with a withered hand would have been profound. Beyond the practical limitations, you would have faced constant reminders of your difference and dependency. The visibility of your condition would have made it impossible to hide your disability, and you would have been subject to stares, comments, and assumptions about your character or spiritual state based on your physical appearance. The biblical narrative describes Jesus asking you to stretch out your hand, and when you did, it was restored completely. This detail is medically significant because it demonstrates that the healing involved not just the return of muscle mass, but also the restoration of neural function and coordination. Someone with a truly withered hand would have lost the ability to voluntarily extend their fingers, making the act of stretching out the hand a demonstration of complete healing. The reaction of the witnesses to your healing would have been immediate and powerful. The transformation from a visibly atrophied, non-functional hand to a normal, healthy limb would have been impossible to deny or attribute to natural causes. The completeness of the restoration, including muscle mass, strength, and coordination, would have provided undeniable evidence of miraculous intervention. The long-term consequences of your healing would have extended far beyond just the restoration of physical function. Your economic opportunities would have been completely transformed, allowing you to return to productive work and self-sufficiency. Your social status would have been elevated, and you would have been freed from the stigma and assumptions that have been associated with your disability. Modern medical understanding reveals that true restoration of severely atrophied muscle tissue is virtually impossible through natural means. Once muscle fibers are lost due to lack of neural stimulation or progressive disease, they cannot be regenerated without extensive rehabilitation that takes months or years. The instant restoration described in the biblical account would be considered medically impossible under normal circumstances. The specific mention of the right hand is particularly significant because this was the hand used for most important activities in ancient culture. The right hand was used for eating, greeting, blessing, and working. Having your right hand restored would have meant regaining not just physical function, but also the ability to participate fully in social and religious activities that had been limited by your disability. The timing of your healing, occurring in the synagogue on the Sabbath, created theological implications that extended beyond just your personal restoration. The controversy over whether healing constituted work that was forbidden on the Sabbath became a significant issue in Jesus' ministry, highlighting the tension between religious law and compassionate action. Your healing became a focal point for broader questions about the purpose and meaning of religious observance. You live in a world of complete silence and isolation, unable to hear the voices of your loved ones or express your own thoughts and feelings through speech. You're the deaf and dumb man brought to Jesus in the region of Decapolis, and your condition has cut you off from normal human communication and social interaction. In the ancient world, your dual disability would have been seen as particularly severe, potentially indicating divine punishment or demonic possession rather than a medical condition with natural causes. The combination of deafness and muteness described in the biblical account suggests a condition that affected both your ability to receive auditory information and your capacity for speech production. Modern medical understanding reveals that these conditions are often connected. Many people who are born deaf never develop normal speech patterns because they cannot hear the sounds they need to imitate. Your condition might have been congenital, or it might have resulted from illness, injury, or infection that damaged both your auditory system and your ability to speak. Imagine the frustration of being unable to communicate your basic needs, thoughts, or emotions to the people around you. You would have been forced to rely on gestures, facial expressions, and crude sign language that only your closest family members might have understood. Your inability to participate in normal conversation would have isolated you from most social activities and made you appear less intelligent than you actually were to those who didn't know you well. The medical reality of combined deafness and muteness in the ancient world would have been particularly challenging because there was no understanding of the connection between hearing and speech development. Ancient physicians might have treated these as separate conditions, not recognizing that the inability to speak was often a consequence of never having heard normal speech patterns. This lack of understanding would have made effective treatment virtually impossible. The biblical account describes Jesus taking you aside privately, away from the crowd, and using physical touch as part of the healing process. He put his fingers in your ears and touched your tongue with his saliva before saying, "Ephphatha, be opened." This physical approach to healing would have been particularly significant for someone whose primary means of communication was through touch and gesture, rather than auditory or verbal interaction. The immediate restoration of both hearing and speech would have been overwhelming and potentially terrifying. Suddenly being able to hear all the sounds around you, conversations, ambient noise, your own voice, would have created a completely new sensory experience. The ability to produce speech sounds would have required not just the restoration of physical function, but also the instant acquisition of language skills that normally take years to develop. The social implications of your dual disability would have been severe in ancient society. You would have been excluded from many religious activities, unable to participate in normal commercial transactions, and possibly viewed with suspicion or fear by those who believed your condition was supernatural in origin. Your family would have been responsible for your care and protection, as you would have been unable to navigate the social world independently. The psychological impact of living in silence and being unable to express yourself verbally would have been profound. You would have experienced frustration, isolation, and possibly depression as you struggled to connect with others and make your needs known. The inability to participate in normal human conversation would have affected your intellectual and emotional development in ways that would have been difficult for ancient people to understand. The biblical narrative emphasizes that people brought you to Jesus specifically requesting that he lay hands on you, suggesting that your condition was well known in the community, and that physical touch was seen as a potential avenue for healing. The fact that Jesus took you aside privately might have been a recognition that the sudden restoration of hearing and speech would be overwhelming and would require a controlled environment. The reaction of the witnesses to your healing would have been immediate and dramatic. The transformation from someone who could neither hear nor speak to someone who could both receive and produce normal speech would have been impossible to deny. The biblical account mentions that you spoke plainly, indicating that your speech was not just functional but fully articulate, which would have been medically extraordinary. The long-term consequences of your healing would have completely transformed your life. The ability to hear and speak would have opened up opportunities for education, employment, and social participation that had been impossible before. You would have been able to participate in religious activities, engage in normal conversation, and develop relationships that had been limited by your communication barriers. Modern medical understanding reveals that the restoration of hearing and speech in someone with congenital or long-term deafness is extremely complex. Even with modern technology like cochlear implants, the process of learning to interpret sounds and develop speech typically takes months or years of intensive therapy. The instant restoration described in the biblical account would be considered medically impossible under normal circumstances. The specific mention of the healing occurring in the region of Decapolis, a largely Gentile area, is significant because it suggests that your condition was not just a personal medical issue, but part of a broader ministry to non-Jewish populations. Your healing would have served as a powerful demonstration of divine power to people who might not have been familiar with Jewish concepts of healing and divine intervention. The biblical account notes that despite Jesus' instructions to tell no one about the healing, the witnesses spread the news widely. This reaction is psychologically understandable. Witnessing the instant restoration of someone's ability to hear and speak would have been so extraordinary that it would have been difficult to keep secret. The dramatic nature of the healing would have made it a compelling story that demanded to be shared. You've been paralyzed for years, completely dependent on others for every aspect of your daily existence. You can't walk, can't stand, can't even turn yourself over in bed without assistance. Your muscles have atrophied from disuse. Your skin has developed pressure sores from lying in the same position for extended periods. And your spirit has been crushed by the constant reminder of your helplessness. You're the paralytic whose friends lowered him through the roof to reach Jesus, and your condition represents one of the most devastating forms of disability in the ancient world. The Greek word paralytikos, used to describe your condition, indicates complete loss of motor function, likely caused by spinal cord injury, stroke, or a progressive neurological disease. Modern medical analysis suggests that your paralysis was probably below the level of the neck, as you appear to have retained the ability to speak and think clearly. The biblical account doesn't specify the cause of your paralysis, but the severity and duration suggest a condition that had caused permanent damage to your nervous system. Imagine the daily reality of complete paralysis in ancient Palestine. You would have been entirely dependent on family members or friends for feeding, cleaning, and basic hygiene. Your muscles would have contracted and stiffened from lack of use. Your joints would have become frozen in position, and your skin would have been damaged from constant pressure and lack of movement. The risk of infection from bed sores would have been constant and potentially fatal. The medical understanding of paralysis in the ancient world was extremely limited. Physicians might have recognized that the condition was related to injury or disease of the spine or brain, but they would have had no knowledge of the complex neural pathways that control movement or the potential for recovery. Most treatments would have been focused on managing symptoms rather than addressing the underlying cause of the paralysis. The biblical account describes your friend's determination to bring you to Jesus, even to the point of removing part of a roof to lower you down on your mat. This detail provides insight into the social support systems that existed for people with severe disabilities in ancient society. Your friend's willingness to go to such extraordinary lengths suggests both their desperation and their genuine care for your well-being. The immediate restoration of your ability to walk would have been medically extraordinary. Paralysis caused by spinal cord injury or stroke typically results in permanent damage that cannot be reversed without extensive rehabilitation that takes months or years. The instant return of motor function, muscle strength, and coordination would have required not just the healing of damaged nerves, but also the restoration of muscle mass and joint flexibility. The social implications of your paralysis would have been severe in ancient society. You would have been unable to work, unable to participate in most religious activities, and dependent on others for survival. Your condition would have made you a burden on your family and community, and some people might have viewed your paralysis as evidence of sin or divine punishment. The healing would have completely reversed your social status and economic prospects. The psychological impact of years of paralysis would have been devastating. The loss of independence, the constant reminder of your physical limitations, and the social isolation that came with your condition would have created profound depression and hopelessness. The sudden restoration of mobility would have been not just physically transformative, but psychologically liberating. The biblical narrative emphasizes that Jesus addressed your spiritual condition before your physical healing, saying, "Your sins are forgiven," before commanding you to rise and walk. This sequence highlights the ancient understanding that physical and spiritual health were intimately connected. The restoration of your ability to walk was seen as evidence of your spiritual healing as well as your physical recovery. The reaction of the witnesses to your healing would have been immediate and overwhelming. Seeing someone who had been paralyzed for years suddenly stand up, pick up their mat, and walk away would have been impossible to explain through natural means. The biblical account mentions that the crowd was amazed and glorified God, recognizing that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The long-term consequences of your healing would have extended far beyond just the restoration of physical function. You would have been able to return to productive work, participate in religious activities, and regain your independence and dignity. The psychological transformation from helplessness to capability would have been as significant as the physical healing itself. Modern medical understanding reveals that complete recovery from long-term paralysis is virtually impossible without extensive rehabilitation and therapy. The muscles would need to be gradually strengthened, the joints would need to be mobilized, and the neural pathways would need to be retrained. The instant restoration described in the biblical account would be considered medically impossible under normal circumstances. The specific instruction to take up your mat and walk is medically significant because it demonstrates that your healing was complete and immediate. Someone recovering from paralysis would normally require assistance and support to stand and walk. The fact that you could immediately carry your own mat indicates that you had regained not just basic mobility, but full strength and coordination. The location of your healing, in a house filled with people who had come to hear Jesus teach, created a dramatic public demonstration of divine power. The fact that your friends had to lower you through the roof because of the crowds suggests that your healing occurred in front of a large audience, who could serve as witnesses to the miraculous nature of your recovery. You've been bleeding for 12 years straight, and it's slowly killing you. What started as an abnormal menstrual period has become a constant hemorrhage that has drained your strength, your finances, and your hope. You're the woman with the issue of blood, and your condition has made you ritually unclean, socially isolated, and medically desperate. You've tried every physician, every remedy, every treatment available, but nothing has stopped the relentless flow of blood that's consuming your life. The Greek word rhesis, used to describe your condition, indicates a continuous flow or discharge, suggesting that your bleeding was not cyclical like normal menstruation, but constant and uncontrolled. Modern medical analysis points to several possible causes for such chronic bleeding, including uterine fibroids, endometriosis, hormonal imbalances, or even uterine cancer. The 12-year duration indicates a chronic condition that was progressively worsening and had become life-threatening. Imagine the medical reality of chronic hemorrhage in the ancient world. You would have been severely anemic from the constant blood loss, leaving you pale, weak, and constantly fatigued. Your heart would have been working overtime to pump your diminished blood supply, causing palpitations and shortness of breath with minimal exertion. The iron deficiency would have affected your ability to think clearly and would have made you vulnerable to infections and other complications. The biblical account mentions that you had suffered many things of many physicians and had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. This detail provides insight into the primitive state of ancient gynecological medicine. Physicians might have tried various treatments, including herbal remedies, dietary restrictions, bloodletting, which would have made your condition worse, or even primitive surgical procedures that could have caused additional complications. The social implications of your condition would have been devastating in ancient Jewish society. According to Levitical law, a woman with any kind of vaginal bleeding was considered ritually unclean and was prohibited from normal social and religious activities. You would have been unable to touch other people, participate in religious ceremonies, or even enter the temple. Your condition would have made you a social outcast in your own community. The psychological impact of 12 years of chronic bleeding would have been profound. The constant reminder of your condition, the progressive weakening of your body, and the social isolation would have created severe depression and despair. The financial burden of seeking medical treatment would have added stress and anxiety to your already overwhelming physical and emotional suffering. The biblical narrative describes your desperate attempt to touch Jesus' garment, believing that even this minimal contact would heal you. This detail reveals the depth of your faith and desperation. You were willing to risk ritual contamination of a holy man and potential public exposure of your condition for the chance of healing. The fact that you approached from behind suggests your desire to remain anonymous and avoid the shame of public acknowledgement. The immediate cessation of your bleeding would have been medically extraordinary. Chronic hemorrhage caused by structural problems like fibroids or endometriosis typically requires surgical intervention or hormonal treatment to resolve. The instant stopping of bleeding that had continued for 12 years would have indicated complete healing of whatever underlying condition was causing the hemorrhage. The biblical account emphasizes that you felt immediately that you were healed, and Jesus confirmed that your faith had made you whole. This interaction suggests that the healing was not just physical but also spiritual and emotional. The restoration of your health would have been accompanied by the restoration of your social status and religious standing in the community. The reaction of Jesus to your healing demonstrates the compassionate approach to conditions that were often stigmatized in ancient society. Rather than condemning you for contaminating him through touch, he publicly acknowledged your faith and pronounced your healing complete. This response would have been particularly significant for someone who had been marginalized and isolated because of her medical condition. The long-term consequences of your healing would have been transformative. The restoration of your health would have allowed you to return to normal social and religious activities, regain your strength and vitality, and rebuild relationships that had been disrupted by your condition. The psychological relief of being freed from a condition that had dominated your life for 12 years would have been overwhelming. Modern medical understanding reveals that chronic uterine bleeding can indeed be life-threatening if left untreated. The constant blood loss leads to severe anemia, which can cause heart failure, organ damage, and death. The fact that you had survived 12 years of continuous bleeding suggests either that the hemorrhage was not as severe as it might have been, or that you had received some supportive care that helped maintain your blood volume. The specific mention of the 12-year duration is medically significant because it indicates that your condition had become chronic and was unlikely to resolve spontaneously. Most acute causes of uterine bleeding either resolve quickly or become fatal within a shorter time frame. The long duration suggests a structural or systemic problem that would have required intervention to resolve. The biblical account notes that you had spent all your money on physicians and treatments, highlighting the economic burden of chronic illness in the ancient world. Without insurance or social support systems, the cost of medical care could quickly bankrupt families and leave patients without resources for basic survival. Your financial destitution would have added to your desperation and made your condition even more hopeless. The description of your condition getting worse despite medical treatment reflects the limited effectiveness of ancient gynecological interventions. Many treatments might have actually exacerbated the bleeding through inappropriate manipulation, the use of irritating substances, or procedures that caused additional trauma to already damaged tissue. The progression of your condition, despite extensive medical attention, would have confirmed the hopelessness of your situation. The timing of your healing, occurring in the midst of a crowd as Jesus was traveling to heal another person, demonstrates the spontaneous nature of the miracle. You weren't brought to Jesus by friends or family, and you didn't make a formal request for healing. The restoration of your health occurred simply through your faith and your desperate attempt to touch his garment, suggesting that divine healing could occur even without direct intervention or formal prayer. You're sitting by the roadside in Jericho, and your world is one of complete darkness and dependency. You're Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, and you've been blind for so long that you can barely remember what colors look like or how the world appears to those with sight. Your days are spent begging from passersby, dependent on their charity for your basic survival. In the ancient world, blindness has relegated you to the lowest levels of society, making you not just physically disabled, but economically and socially marginalized. The biblical account doesn't specify the cause of your blindness, but in the ancient world, several conditions commonly led to loss of sight. Trachoma, caused by bacterial infection, was endemic in many regions and could cause scarring of the cornea that resulted in complete blindness. Cataracts, though treatable with modern surgery, were incurable in ancient times and could cause progressive vision loss. Vitamin A deficiency, common in populations with poor nutrition, could also lead to permanent blindness. Imagine the daily reality of blindness in first-century Palestine. You would have been unable to work at most occupations, making begging your primary means of survival. You would have had to memorize the layout of your immediate environment to navigate safely, and any change in familiar surroundings could have left you disoriented and helpless. The constant danger of stumbling, falling, or walking into obstacles would have made even simple movements treacherous. The medical understanding of blindness in ancient times was primitive and heavily influenced by religious beliefs. Some physicians recognized that certain eye conditions could be treated with herbal remedies or surgical procedures, but many forms of blindness were considered incurable. The idea that blindness might be punishment for sin, either personal or ancestral, was widespread and added spiritual stigma to the physical disability. The biblical narrative describes you calling out to Jesus as you pass by, addressing him as Son of David, and begging for mercy. This indicates that despite your blindness, you were well informed about current events and had heard enough about Jesus to recognize his potential as a healer. Your persistence in calling out despite being told to be quiet demonstrates both your desperation and your faith in Jesus' ability to heal. The social response to your calling out reveals the marginalized status of disabled beggars in ancient society. The crowd tried to silence you, viewing your interruption as inappropriate and embarrassing. This reaction highlights how people with disabilities were often seen as nuisances rather than individuals deserving of compassion and attention. Your determination to continue calling out despite social pressure shows remarkable courage and faith. The immediate restoration of your sight would have been medically extraordinary. Regardless of the original cause of your blindness, whether corneal scarring, cataracts, retinal damage, or congenital abnormalities, the instant return of normal vision would have required the complete regeneration or healing of damaged ocular structures. Modern medicine has no equivalent for such immediate and complete restoration of sight. The psychological impact of suddenly regaining sight after years, or perhaps a lifetime of blindness, would have been overwhelming. The sudden influx of visual information, colors, shapes, faces, movement, would have been difficult for your brain to process. Most people who regain sight after long-term blindness require extensive rehabilitation to learn how to interpret visual cues. But your immediate ability to see and follow Jesus suggests complete and perfect restoration. The biblical account mentions that you immediately received sight and followed Jesus in the way. This detail is medically significant because it indicates that your healing was not just partial or gradual, but complete and immediate. Someone recovering from blindness would normally need time to adjust to their restored vision and learn to navigate visually. But your ability to immediately follow suggests perfect restoration of both sight and visual processing. The long-term consequences of your healing would have been transformative in every aspect of your life. The restoration of sight would have opened up opportunities for employment, education, and social participation that had been impossible during your blindness. You would have been able to move from complete dependency to self-sufficiency, dramatically improving both your economic prospects and your social status. The location of your healing, on the road outside Jericho as Jesus was traveling, created a public demonstration of divine power that would have been witnessed by many travelers and local residents. The dramatic nature of the healing, combined with your immediate response of following Jesus, would have served as a powerful testimony to the reality of miraculous healing and would have contributed to Jesus' growing reputation. Modern ophthalmological understanding reveals that the restoration of sight depends heavily on the underlying cause of blindness. Conditions that damage the optic nerve or visual cortex typically result in permanent vision loss that cannot be reversed. Even conditions that affect the eye structures themselves, such as severe cataracts or corneal scarring, require complex surgical procedures to restore vision. The instant, complete healing described in the biblical account would be considered medically impossible under normal circumstances. The specific mention of your name and your father's name in the biblical account is unusual and suggests that you became a well-known figure in the early Christian community. This personal identification indicates that your healing was not just a private event but became part of the public testimony about Jesus' healing ministry. Your story would have been retold many times as evidence of divine power. The economic implications of your transformation from beggar to follower would have been significant. The ability to see would have qualified you for various types of work that had been impossible during your blindness. However, your immediate decision to follow Jesus rather than pursue economic opportunities suggests that the spiritual impact of your healing was even more significant than the practical benefits. The description of your healing emphasizes that it was your faith that made you whole, highlighting the connection between spiritual belief and physical healing in the biblical understanding of divine intervention. This aspect of the accounts suggests that the restoration of your sight was not just a demonstration of power, but a response to genuine faith and persistent seeking. You're the father of a boy who is slowly being destroyed by a condition that ancient people called demon possession, but that modern medicine recognizes as severe epilepsy. Your son experiences violent seizures that leave him convulsing on the ground, foaming at the mouth, and sometimes throwing himself into fire or water in ways that could kill him. You've watched helplessly as these episodes have become more frequent and more severe, and you're desperate for any intervention that might save your child's life. The biblical account describes symptoms that are classic for severe epilepsy with complex partial seizures. The dumb spirit that supposedly possesses your son manifests as episodes where he becomes unresponsive, falls to the ground, and experiences violent convulsions. The description of gnashing teeth, foaming at the mouth, and becoming rigid are all consistent with grand mal seizures. The detail about throwing himself into fire and water suggests the dangerous automatisms that can occur during certain types of seizures. Imagine the medical reality of severe childhood epilepsy in the ancient world. Your son would have experienced sudden, unpredictable episodes that could occur at any time without warning. During a seizure, he would have lost consciousness and control of his movements, potentially injuring himself or others nearby. The psychological trauma of witnessing these episodes repeatedly would have been overwhelming for your entire family. The ancient understanding of epilepsy was entirely supernatural, with seizures interpreted as evidence of demonic possession or divine punishment. The dramatic nature of epileptic episodes, the sudden loss of consciousness, violent movements, and altered behavior, seem to support the belief that evil spirits were controlling the victim's body. This interpretation made epilepsy not just a medical condition, but a spiritual crisis that required religious rather than medical intervention. The biblical narrative describes your frustration with Jesus' disciples, who were unable to heal your son despite their previous success with other conditions. This detail reveals the particularly challenging nature of severe epilepsy, which can be resistant to treatment even today. The failure of the disciples to provide healing would have added to your desperation and made the eventual healing by Jesus even more significant. The seizure that occurred in Jesus' presence is described in vivid medical detail. The boy fell to the ground, wallowed, and foamed at the mouth. This description is entirely consistent with a tonic-clonic seizure, including the characteristic foaming caused by increased salivation and the difficulty swallowing during the episode. The biblical account also mentions that many people thought the boy was dead, which sometimes happens when seizures are particularly severe or prolonged. The medical dangers of severe epilepsy would have been extreme in the ancient world. Without modern understanding of seizure management, your son would have been at constant risk of injury during episodes. The tendency to throw himself into fire or water during seizures would have made supervision essential for his survival. The lack of effective treatments would have meant that the condition could only worsen over time. The social implications of having an epileptic child would have been devastating for your family. The belief that epilepsy was caused by demonic possession would have made your son an object of fear and suspicion in the community. Your family might have been ostracized or blamed for whatever sin had supposedly attracted the demons. The unpredictable nature of the seizures would have made it difficult for your son to participate in normal childhood activities or education. The psychological impact on your son would have been severe, assuming he retained consciousness and memory of his condition. The knowledge that he could lose control at any moment, combined with the social stigma and fear he generated in others, would have created profound anxiety and depression. The physical injuries from seizures would have been compounded by the emotional trauma of being seen as possessed or cursed. The biblical account emphasizes the role of faith in the healing, with Jesus saying, "All things are possible to him that believeth." Your response, "Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief," reveals the complex psychological state of a desperate parent who wants to have faith but has been worn down by years of suffering and disappointment. This honest acknowledgement of doubt, mixed with hope, would have resonated with many parents facing similar situations. The immediate cessation of seizures would have been medically extraordinary. Severe epilepsy typically requires ongoing medication to control, and even with modern anticonvulsants, some cases remain resistant to treatment. The complete elimination of seizure activity would have indicated fundamental changes in brain function that are not possible through natural means. The long-term consequences of your son's healing would have extended far beyond just the elimination of seizures. The restoration of normal brain function would have allowed him to develop cognitively, socially, and emotionally in ways that had been impossible during his illness. Your family would have been freed from the constant anxiety and supervision required to keep him safe during seizures. Modern neurological understanding reveals that epilepsy is caused by abnormal electrical activity in the brain, often resulting from structural abnormalities, genetic factors, or brain injuries. The sudden cessation of all seizure activity would require immediate normalization of brain function, which is not possible with current medical interventions. Even successful epilepsy surgery typically requires months of recovery and adjustment. The description of the boy as having a dumb spirit suggests that his seizures were accompanied by periods of inability to speak, which is consistent with certain types of complex partial seizures that affect language centers in the brain. The restoration of normal speech, along with the elimination of seizures, would have indicated complete healing of whatever brain dysfunction was causing the epilepsy. The public nature of the healing, occurring in front of a crowd that had gathered to watch, created a powerful demonstration of divine power over conditions that were considered impossible to cure. The dramatic nature of the seizure, followed immediately by complete recovery, would have been impossible to deny or attribute to natural causes. You're a woman who has been bent over for 18 years, unable to stand up straight or look anyone in the eye. Your spine has become so curved and rigid that you walk hunched forward, your face toward the ground, seeing only feet and dirt as you struggle through each day. You're the woman with the spirit of infirmity, and your condition has transformed you from a normal, upright human being into someone who appears broken and defeated, physically embodying the oppression that has dominated your life. The biblical account describes your condition as being caused by a spirit of infirmity that had bound you for 18 years, making you unable to lift up yourself. Modern medical analysis suggests you were suffering from severe kyphoscoliosis, an abnormal curvature of the spine that can be caused by various conditions including ankylosing spondylitis, osteoporosis with compression fractures, or muscular dystrophy. The 18-year duration indicates a progressive condition that had worsened gradually over time. Imagine the daily reality of living with severe spinal deformity in ancient Palestine. Every step would have been painful and exhausting as your twisted spine forced you to support your body weight in an unnatural position. Your field of vision would have been limited to the ground immediately in front of you, making it impossible to make normal eye contact or see the world around you properly. Simple tasks like carrying objects or reaching for items would have been extremely difficult or impossible. The medical progression of severe spinal curvature would have been relentless and painful. As your spine became more deformed, the muscles supporting it would have been strained constantly, causing chronic pain and fatigue. Your internal organs would have been compressed by the abnormal positioning, potentially affecting your breathing, digestion, and circulation. The psychological impact of watching your body slowly fold in on itself would have been devastating. Ancient understanding of spinal deformity was limited to observing the visible effects without comprehending the underlying bone and joint problems. The curved spine might have been attributed to carrying heavy loads, poor posture, or supernatural causes. The treatments available would have been completely ineffective, perhaps attempts at physical manipulation, herbal remedies for pain, or religious rituals to address the presumed spiritual causes. The biblical narrative describes your healing occurring in the synagogue on the Sabbath, creating controversy about whether healing constituted work that was forbidden on the day of rest. Your presence in the synagogue, despite your severe disability, suggests remarkable determination to participate in religious life, despite the physical challenges and potential social stigma associated with your condition. The social implications of your deformity would have been significant in ancient society. Your inability to stand upright would have affected how others perceived and interacted with you. The physical reminder of your condition would have been impossible to hide, making you subject to stares, comments, and assumptions about your character or spiritual state. Your hunched posture might have been interpreted as a sign of shame, defeat, or divine punishment. The biblical account emphasizes that Jesus called you forward and laid hands on you before declaring you freed from your infirmity. The physical touch involved in the healing would have been particularly significant for someone whose condition had likely limited normal human contact. The public nature of the healing occurring in front of the synagogue congregation would have made the transformation immediately apparent to many witnesses. The immediate straightening of your spine would have been medically extraordinary. Severe spinal deformity that develops over 18 years typically involves structural changes in the bones, joints, and surrounding tissues that cannot be reversed without extensive surgical intervention. The instant restoration of normal spinal alignment would have required the immediate correction of multiple anatomical abnormalities. The physical sensation of suddenly being able to stand upright after 18 years would have been overwhelming. Your muscles would have needed to immediately adapt to supporting your body in a completely different position. Your internal organs would have been repositioned as your torso expanded to its normal configuration. The change in your field of vision from looking at the ground to being able to see at eye level would have been psychologically dramatic. The biblical narrative notes that you immediately glorified God after being healed, suggesting that the transformation was not just physical, but spiritual and emotional. The ability to stand upright would have restored not just your physical posture, but your human dignity and sense of worth. The public acknowledgement of divine intervention would have provided a powerful testimony to the reality of miraculous healing. The long-term consequences of your healing would have been transformative in every aspect of your life. The restoration of normal posture would have eliminated the chronic pain and fatigue that had dominated your existence for 18 years. Your ability to function normally would have opened up opportunities for work, social interaction, and religious participation that had been severely limited by your disability. Modern orthopedic understanding reveals that severe spinal deformity typically results from progressive changes in bone structure, joint alignment, and soft tissue that develop over years. The correction of such deformity usually requires complex surgical procedures involving the placement of rods, screws, and bone grafts, followed by months of rehabilitation. The instant correction described in the biblical account would be considered medically impossible under normal circumstances. The psychological impact of your transformation would have extended beyond just personal relief. The change from being bent over and unable to see the world normally to standing upright and making eye contact would have represented a fundamental shift in how you related to other people and how they related to you. The restoration of normal posture would have symbolized freedom from the bondage that had defined your life for 18 years. The timing of your healing on the Sabbath created theological implications that extended beyond your personal restoration. The controversy over whether healing constituted work became a focal point for broader questions about the purpose of religious observance and the priority of human need over ritual requirements. Your healing became an example of compassionate action, taking precedence over rigid rule following. You're Malchus, servant of the high priest, and you've just had your ear completely severed by Simon Peter's sword during the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Blood is streaming down the side of your head from where your right ear used to be. The pain is excruciating, and you're in shock from the sudden violence and trauma. In the ancient world, such an injury would typically result in permanent disfigurement, chronic pain, and complete hearing loss on the affected side. But you're about to experience what might be the most immediate and complete reconstruction of severed anatomy in biblical history. The biblical account specifically mentions that Peter cut off his right ear, indicating complete amputation rather than just a superficial wound. Modern medical understanding reveals that such an injury would have involved cutting through skin, cartilage, and potentially parts of the ear canal and surrounding structures. The bleeding would have been profuse, as the ear has a rich blood supply, and the pain would have been immediate and severe. Imagine the medical reality of traumatic ear amputation in first-century Palestine. The severed ear would have been completely separated from your head, lying on the ground amid the chaos of the arrest, without immediate surgical reattachment, which was impossible with ancient medical knowledge. The wound would have healed as an open cavity, leaving you permanently disfigured and deaf on one side. The risk of infection would have been enormous, potentially leading to life-threatening complications. The ancient understanding of traumatic amputations was limited to basic wound care and attempts to stop bleeding. Physicians might have tried to pack the wound with cloth, apply pressure to control hemorrhage, or use astringent substances to help with clotting. However, they had no knowledge of microsurgery, nerve repair, or the complex procedures required to reattach severed body parts. Your ear would have been considered permanently lost. The biblical narrative describes Jesus immediately touching your ear and healing you completely. The restoration would have required not just the reattachment of the severed ear, but the immediate repair of all the damaged structures: skin, cartilage, blood vessels, nerves, and potentially parts of the inner ear. The healing would have had to occur instantly and perfectly to restore both appearance and function. The medical complexity of ear reattachment reveals why this healing was so extraordinary. The ear contains intricate structures, including the external auditory canal, the eardrum, and delicate bones that transmit sound. The restoration would have required the immediate regeneration of cartilage, the reconnection of tiny blood vessels, and the repair of auditory nerves. Even with modern microsurgical techniques, such reconstruction would be extremely challenging. The immediate restoration of hearing would have been as medically significant as the physical reattachment. Your auditory system would have needed to resume normal function instantly, with all the neural pathways intact and properly connected. The ability to hear normally immediately after such severe trauma would have indicated complete healing at the cellular and molecular level. The psychological impact of experiencing such sudden trauma followed by immediate healing would have been overwhelming. The shock of having your ear severed, the pain and fear of the injury, and then the amazement of instantaneous restoration would have created a profound emotional experience. The transition from victim of violence to recipient of miraculous healing would have fundamentally changed your understanding of the events taking place. The social implications of your healing in the context of Jesus' arrest would have been significant. As a servant of the high priest, you were part of the religious establishment that was opposing Jesus. The fact that he chose to heal you despite your role in his arrest demonstrated compassion for enemies and concern for individual suffering, even in the midst of his own crisis. The biblical account notes that this was the last healing Jesus performed before his crucifixion, making it particularly significant in the narrative of his ministry. The restoration of your ear served as a final demonstration of divine power and compassion, even as Jesus was being taken away to face trial and execution. The healing also served to prevent further violence by demonstrating that force was not necessary or appropriate. The witness value of your healing would have been enormous. As someone connected to the religious hierarchy, your testimony about what happened would have carried weight with the very people who were opposing Jesus. The undeniable reality of your restored ear would have provided powerful evidence of divine intervention that would have been difficult for the religious authorities to dismiss or explain away. Modern reconstructive surgery reveals the complexity of ear reattachment and reconstruction. Even with advanced microsurgical techniques, the reattachment of a completely severed ear requires hours of delicate surgery to reconnect blood vessels, nerves, and other structures. The success rate for maintaining viability and function is limited even under optimal conditions. The instant, complete restoration described in the biblical account would be considered medically impossible. The specific mention of the right ear in the biblical account is significant because this was typically the more socially important ear in ancient culture. The right side was associated with strength and honor, making the restoration of the right ear particularly meaningful. A complete healing would have preserved not just your physical function, but also your social standing and personal dignity. The long-term consequences of your healing would have extended far beyond just a physical restoration. The experience of being healed by the man your master was arresting would have created profound questions about the true nature of Jesus and the validity of the charges against him. Your personal encounter with divine compassion would have challenged your understanding of the religious and political events unfolding around you. The contrast between Peter's violent action and Jesus' healing response highlighted the fundamental difference between human and divine approaches to conflict. The immediate healing of the damage caused by Peter's sword demonstrated that divine power was concerned with restoration and healing rather than destruction and violence. Your restored ear became a symbol of redemption, triumphing over retribution. The medical impossibility of instant ear reattachment and restoration makes this healing one of the most dramatically supernatural events in biblical history. The complete regeneration of complex anatomical structures, the immediate restoration of function, and the perfect cosmetic result would have provided undeniable evidence of divine intervention that transcended all natural medical possibilities. This completes our journey through the most bizarre biblical diseases and their cures, from the consuming worms of Herod to the restored ear of Malchus. Each condition reveals not just the medical realities of ancient life, but the profound human experiences of suffering, hope, and the desperate search for healing in a world where medicine was primitive and divine intervention seemed like the only hope for impossible cures. These accounts remind us that behind every biblical healing was a real person experiencing genuine physical suffering, social stigma, and psychological trauma. Their stories continue to resonate because the fundamental human experiences of illness, disability, and the longing for wholeness remain unchanged across the millennia. Whether we interpret these healings as literal historical events or powerful metaphors for spiritual transformation, they speak to our deepest hopes for healing and restoration in a world still marked by suffering and disease.